It began in a place that most people never notice, a quiet village pressed into rolling ground near the German border, where roads narrowed, fields stretched low, and winter stripped the land of anything soft. Singling was not famous, it was not fortified, it did not appear in bold on operational maps. And yet, in the closing months of the war in the West, Singling became a place where exhaustion, resistance, and determination collided head-on. By the time the fighting reached Singling, the war had changed its tone. This was no longer the sweeping movement of early campaigns, no longer the shock of surprise or the illusion of quick victory. This was the slow, grinding phase, where every village mattered, every road was contested, and every advance felt heavier than the last. Winter clung stubbornly to the ground. Fields were frozen hard, then thawed into mud that swallowed boots and tracks alike. The air carried damp cold that settled into uniforms and bones. Visibility shifted constantly, fog in the morning, low cloud by afternoon, darkness arriving early and without mercy. The land offered little comfort and no forgiveness. Singling sat directly in the path of advancing American forces pushing deeper toward Germany. The enemy here was no longer overextended and rushing blindly forward. German units defending Singling were fighting a delaying war, stubborn, methodical, and deeply familiar with the ground beneath them. They knew which roads could be mined, which buildings offered cover, which fields funneled movement into narrow killing zones. Every retreat was calculated to cost time, men, and momentum. For the Americans approaching the village, nothing came easily. Artillery fire cracked across open ground, shells bursting in fields that offered no place to hide. Small arms fire snapped from tree lines and stone buildings. Mines lay hidden beneath churned soil and debris. Progress slowed to yards measured in blood and fatigue rather than miles. Singling became a test of patience. Infantry advanced cautiously, clearing ground step by step. Tanks moved carefully, aware that narrow roads and close terrain limited their strength. Engineers worked under fire, clearing obstacles and repairing routes that barely held together. Communication faltered, units lost contact, orders arrived late or incomplete, and still, the advance continued. The fighting in and around Singling was not defined by dramatic charges or sweeping maneuvers. It was defined by pressure, constant, unrelenting pressure applied against defenders who refused to collapse quickly. Buildings were cleared room by room, positions were taken, lost, and taken again. The village itself slowly unraveled under the weight of artillery and small arms fire, its quiet streets turned into corridors of danger. Night offered little relief. Darkness concealed movement but amplified fear. Flares lit the sky in harsh white bursts. Patrols moved cautiously, listening for footsteps that might never come, or might come all at once. The cold deepened. Exhaustion settled into every movement. For many soldiers, Singling blurred into an endless cycle of advance, hold, endure. The German defense did not aim to win outright. It aimed to delay. Every hour gained meant something farther east could be prepared. Every unit slowed meant another day bought for a collapsing front. Singling mattered not because of its size, but because of its position in time, one more obstacle between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Eventually, pressure did what speed could not. The defenses cracked unevenly, resistance thinned. German units withdrew under fire, slipping away toward the next line, leaving behind wreckage, mines, and silence. Singling fell not with a dramatic collapse, but with the quiet realization that the ground could no longer be held. The village was left scarred, walls broken, fields torn apart, roads littered with debris, another place crossed off, a map, another step forward in a war that was clearly ending, but still demanded everything. The Battle of Singling is rarely spoken of because it does not fit neatly into legend. There is no single heroic moment that defines it. Instead, it represents the reality of late war combat, the slow, costly advance through places that resisted simply because they could, and because delaying was their final weapon. It reminds us that wars do not end cleanly. They end village by village, road by road, through fatigue, persistence, and the refusal to stop moving forward even when victory feels distant. Tonight, we return to Singling, to the frozen fields and narrow roads, to the soldiers who fought without spectacle, without shortcuts, and without certainty. To a battle that mattered not because it was famous, but because it was necessary. Before we continue, I want to pause and bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has settled around you there? Is it late and quiet, or is the day just beginning to ease its grip? If these quieter chapters of history help you slow down, reflect, or feel grounded as the world fades into night, consider subscribing, not for dramatic moments, but for the steady presence of stories that move at the pace history actually unfolds. Settle in. This is the complete history of the Battle of Singling, and it is a story built from endurance. The morning of December 6th, 1944, arrived cold and bitter across the Alsace plain. Frost clung to the barrels of 33-ton Sherman tanks as crews emerged from farmhouses where they had slept fitfully, breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen stamped his boots against frozen mud, watching his loader climb onto their M4 Sherman, designated Cobra King II, its olive-drab paint scarred from 3 months of combat since Normandy. The men of Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, were preparing for what their captain called a routine advance, a phrase that had lost all meaning somewhere between the hedgerows of France and the approach to Germany's border. They had covered 1,200 miles since landing in Europe, spearheading General George Patton's Third Army through France with such speed and violence that German commanders spoke of them with respect and fear. This morning, they were told, would be simple: advance toward a small village called Singling, clear out whatever Wehrmacht stragglers remained, and continue the push toward the Siegfried Line. What the intelligence briefings had not told them, what the confident maps with their bold arrows failed to reveal, was that the German 11th Panzer Division had transformed Singling into a killing ground. The 4th Armored Division had earned its reputation through aggressive maneuver warfare, the kind of rapid armored thrusts that had shattered German lines across France. Their doctrine emphasized speed over caution, exploitation over consolidation, the kind of warfare that depended on enemy disorganization and American momentum. It had worked brilliantly for 5 months, from the breakout at Avranches through the liberation of Paris, across the Moselle River and into Lorraine. Patton himself spoke of the 4th Armored with pride, calling them his Sunday punch, the division that he could rely on to break through when others stalled. The men themselves had begun to believe in their own invincibility, that combination of confidence and esprit de corps that marks elite units. But December 6th marked a shift neither the men nor their commanders fully understood yet. The weather had turned brutal, with temperatures hovering around freezing, transforming the autumn mud into iron-hard ground. The fields between their position and Singling stretched flat and exposed, offering little cover for an advance. Lieutenant William Cowgill, commanding officer of Company A, studied his maps in the gray light of dawn, marking routes of advance with a grease pencil. At 24 years old, he had already led his company through a dozen engagements, earning a reputation for aggressive tactics, tempered with genuine care for his men. This morning's briefing had been routine. German forces in Singling were believed to be light, perhaps a company of infantry with limited anti-tank capability, remnants of units battered in the retreat across France. Air reconnaissance had been limited due to weather, and intelligence reports spoke of German units withdrawing toward the Rhine. Everything pointed to a quick action, perhaps a few hours of combat, casualties light, objectives secured. The Sherman tanks of Company A began their approach march at 0700 hours, tracks clanking in the cold morning air as they moved through destroyed French villages. These M4 Shermans represented American industrial might, reliable, mechanically sound, produced in numbers that staggered the imagination. The men knew their tank's specifications by heart: a 75mm main gun, frontal armor 2 inches thick, a 4GAA engine that gave them a top speed of 30 miles per hour on roads. The Sherman had served them well enough in France, where American superiority in numbers, air power, and artillery had overcome any technical shortcomings. Tank crews had heard rumors of German Panthers and Tigers, whispers of superior armor and devastating guns, but most had never faced these vehicles in combat. The 4th Armored's success had been built on avoiding set-piece battles, hitting German forces on the move, exploiting gaps rather than confronting strength. Singling was supposed to fit that pattern: another village, another advance, another push toward victory. By 1400 hours, the lead platoon was approaching Singling from the south, commanders scanning through periscopes for signs of enemy activity. The village itself appeared quiet, stone buildings clustered around a church, bare winter trees providing minimal cover. What the American tankers could not see were the carefully concealed positions where German Panther tanks waited, their crews having spent the previous day preparing fields of fire and camouflaging their 45-ton monsters among buildings and berms. The German gunners had ranged the approaches, marking distances with stakes visible only to them, calculating the precise moments when American tanks would enter their kill zones. They had orders to wait, to hold fire until multiple targets presented themselves, to make every shot count. The tactical situation the Americans were walking into represented a fundamental mismatch: aggressive doctrine meeting defensive preparation, inferior technology confronting superior firepower, momentum colliding with patience. At 16:45 hours, as winter light began to fade, everything changed. The lead Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Thomas Walsh, advanced to within 1,200 meters of Singling's southern edge. Through his periscope, Walsh saw nothing unusual, just another French village waiting to be liberated. Then the world exploded. A Panther tank, concealed among Singling's buildings, fired its 75mm KWK-42 gun, a weapon of entirely different magnitude than anything the Sherman could mount. The armor-piercing round crossed 1,200 meters in less than 2 seconds, striking Walsh's Sherman squarely on its frontal armor. The penetration was catastrophic. The tungsten core projectile punched through 2 inches of American steel as if it were paper, exploding inside the crew compartment with a pressure wave that killed 3 men instantly. The Sherman's ammunition detonated moments later, the turret lifting 20 feet into the air on a pillar of flame, a sight that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Within 4 minutes, 3 more Shermans were burning, though German Panthers fired with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate, each hit catastrophic. American return fire proved futile. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate Panther armor at these ranges, rounds bouncing off angled plates or shattering against hardened steel. The Americans were dying without inflicting casualties, trapped in a nightmare scenario their doctrine had never prepared them for. Radio nets crackled with desperate calls. "We can't hurt them! Pull back! Pull back! Jesus Christ, they're everywhere!" Lieutenant Cowgill, his own tank taking a direct hit that killed his radio operator, ordered withdrawal through smoke. By 1700 hours, Company A had pulled back 800 meters, leaving 5 burning Shermans behind, 11 men dead, 7 wounded. The engagement had lasted 15 minutes. The survivors sat in shocked silence that night, gathered in a commandeered farmhouse 2 miles from Singling. Men who had fought across France, who had survived Normandy's hedgerows and the Moselle crossing, struggled to process what they had experienced. The technical disparity they had heard rumors about had become lethal reality. German tanks could kill them at ranges where American tanks could not even damage enemy armor. The confidence built over months of successful operations evaporated in 15 minutes of one-sided slaughter. Sergeant Chen, whose tank had survived by being 4th in the column, sat cleaning his pistol with hands that shook slightly. "We never saw them," he said to no one in particular. "We never even saw them until they fired." The broader tactical picture remained unclear to the men of Company A that night. They did not know they had encountered the 11th Panzer Division, a unit rebuilt and re-equipped after being nearly destroyed on the Eastern Front. They did not know that Singling represented a deliberate defensive position, carefully prepared and powerfully armed. They did not know that their own intelligence had failed to identify the German forces, or that their commanders had underestimated the enemy's capability to mount an effective defense. What they did know, with absolute certainty, was that their Shermans were outmatched, their doctrine was insufficient, and their lives depended on equipment that could not protect them. December 6th had revealed a truth that would reshape the campaign. American armor was technologically inferior to its German counterpart, and that inferiority would be paid for in blood. As night fell over the frozen fields of Alsace, 5 pyres marked where American tanks had burned. The men of Company A tried to sleep, knowing that morning would bring orders to attack again. The village of Singling, barely a dot on most maps, had become a place of significance in their personal histories, the place where invincibility died, where confidence met reality, where the cost of technological inferiority became impossible to ignore. The battle for Singling had only begun, but already it had taught lessons that no training exercise could impart. War is not only about courage or doctrine or determination. Sometimes, war is about mathematics, the thickness of armor, the velocity of projectiles, the simple physics of steel meeting steel. And in that cold December, the mathematics favored Germany. 30 kilometers south of Singling, in the forested hills near Barental, the German 11th Panzer Division had undergone a resurrection. Just 6 months earlier, this unit had been virtually destroyed in the Soviet Union's Operation Bagration, its remnants fleeing westward with barely 15% of their original strength. Tank companies that had fielded 14 panzers each limped back to Germany with 1 or 2 battered vehicles. Infantry battalions that had numbered 800 men counted survivors in the dozens. The 11th Panzer Division's war diary from July 1944 made for grim reading, a catalog of losses, retreats, and desperate rearguard actions. But the German High Command, even in defeat, understood the value of experienced cadres. Rather than disbanding the division and distributing its survivors as replacements, they chose to rebuild the 11th Panzer around this core of combat veterans. The transformation took place in autumn 1944, as Germany stripped the Eastern Front of resources to defend against the Western Allies' advance. The 11th Panzer received priority allocation of the Wehrmacht's most powerful weapon, the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther. These 45-ton monsters represented the pinnacle of German tank design, sloped armor up to 120 millimeters thick, a high-velocity 75 millimeter gun that could penetrate enemy armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and a sophisticated fire control system. The Panther had been designed specifically to counter Soviet T-34 tanks on the Eastern Front, but it proved equally devastating against American and British armor. By December 1st, 1944, the 11th Panzer's 3rd Battalion, 15th Panzer Regiment could field 17 operational Panthers, not the full strength of 45 that establishment called for, but more than sufficient for the defensive mission they had been assigned. Major Franz Beke, the division's operations officer, studied the approaches to Singling with professional interest on December 4th. A veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, Beke understood the Americans' tactical preferences: aggressive advances, reliance on air support and artillery, preference for maneuver over set-piece battles. He also understood their weakness, the Sherman tank, which German intelligence reports confirmed was inferior to the Panther in every combat parameter except mechanical reliability. The terrain around Singling offered ideal defensive advantages. The village sat on a slight elevation, providing observation over the flat approaches from the south and west. Stone buildings could conceal hull-down Panthers, allowing German gunners to fire while exposing minimal target area. Tree lines and agricultural berms offered additional concealment. Beke marked his map with red pencil, identifying kill zones at ranges between 800 and 1,500 meters, distances where Panthers could destroy American tanks with near certainty while remaining effectively invulnerable to return fire. The preparation for ambush began immediately. Panther crews moved their vehicles into position during the night of December 5th, when darkness and the sound of artillery fire masked engine noise. Each commander selected his position carefully, looking for natural cover that would conceal the Panther's distinctive silhouette. The Panther's excellent optics, Zeiss rangefinders and gun sights, allowed accurate fire at ranges where American tankers would struggle to even identify targets. Camouflage nets went up, draped with local foliage and arranged to break up the angular lines of turrets and hulls. Infantry from the 111th Panzergrenadier Regiment dug in around the village, preparing positions for their MG-42 machine guns and deploying 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank guns to cover approaches the Panthers might not observe. By dawn on December 6th, Singling had become a trap, waiting only for victims. The German crews waiting in Singling represented the Wehrmacht's accumulated combat expertise. Commander Lieutenant Klaus Becker, whose Panther occupied a position on the village's southern edge, had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. His gunner, Unteroffizier Heinz Schmidt, had claimed 7 tank kills in Russia before the division's retreat. Their loader had memorized the sequence for handling armor-piercing rounds so thoroughly that he could maintain a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute even under stress. This was not the Wehrmacht of 1940, green troops in inferior equipment learning through catastrophic defeats. This was a professional force that had learned through fire, equipped with weapons that could punish mistakes with mechanical efficiency. They knew they faced defeat strategically. Germany's industrial capacity could not match Allied production, and the loss of air superiority meant German forces moved only at night. But tactically, in prepared positions with superior weapons, they could still inflict disproportionate casualties. The 11th Panzer Division's orders emphasized economy of force. Every Panther, every armor-piercing round, every experienced crew member was irreplaceable. Unlike the Americans, who could absorb the loss of 50 tanks and have replacements arrive within days, German forces operated on a wasting asset principle. The 17 Panthers at Singling represented months of production, training, and logistics. They could not be squandered in wild counterattacks, or aggressive maneuvers. Instead, German doctrine emphasized the defensive ambush. Wait for the enemy to enter predetermined kill zones. Destroy him with precise fire. Withdraw before American artillery and air power could respond. It was a doctrine born of necessity, but when executed properly, it could achieve results far beyond the German forces' numerical strength. Radio discipline remained absolute as the American column approached on December 6th afternoon. Panther commanders watched through their excellent optics as Sherman tanks rolled closer, identifying the lead vehicles, estimating range, waiting for the optimum moment. German doctrine emphasized patience. Fire too early and give the enemy time to respond. Fire too late and allow some to escape. Becker's orders were precise. Wait until at least 4 enemy tanks were within kill range, then fire on command. His gunner had already ranged the approach route using pre-positioned markers visible only to German observers. The first shot would be the easiest, before American forces realized they were in an ambush. Subsequent shots would target tanks attempting to withdraw, catching them as they turned to retreat, exposing thinner side armor. When Becker gave the fire command at 16:47 hours, his gunner needed less than 2 seconds to align on target and fire. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun produced a muzzle velocity of 1,000 meters per second, giving the armor-piercing round enormous penetrating power. The shot struck the lead Sherman at 1,200 meters range, center mass on the frontal glacis plate. German crews had been trained to aim for specific weak points on Allied tanks: the whole machine gun mount, the turret ring, the junction between hull and turret. This shot needed no such precision. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges up to 1,800 meters. At 1,200 meters, the tungsten carbide core punched through American steel, through the crew compartment, through the stored ammunition, causing a sympathetic detonation that killed the crew before they could react. 3 more Panthers opened fire within seconds, a disciplined sequence that prevented target confusion. Each commander selected a separate Sherman, ensuring maximum destruction of the American formation. The engagement unfolded exactly as German doctrine prescribed: rapid, devastating, and one-sided. American return fire proved ineffective. 75mm shells from Sherman tanks struck Panther armor and bounced away, the distinctive clang audible even over the battle's chaos. One round struck Becker's Panther directly on the frontal plate, creating a bright flash of sparks but causing no damage. The crew barely felt the impact. German armor-piercing rounds, by contrast, produced catastrophic kills: turrets blown off, hulls split open, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. Within 10 minutes, 5 Shermans were burning, and the American force was retreating. The battle's aftermath left German commanders satisfied but not jubilant. They had achieved the objective, stopping the American advance at minimal cost. But everyone understood the strategic reality. The Americans would return, probably with greater force, possibly with better tactics. German ammunition stocks were limited. The Panthers had expended 37 armor-piercing rounds, roughly 15% of their available supply. Replacements would be slow in coming. The destroyed American tanks would be replaced within days. American industrial capacity ensured that. The 11th Panzer Division had won a tactical victory, inflicting casualties at a 10-to-1 ratio, but it was the kind of victory Germany could no longer afford. Every engagement, even successful ones, depleted irreplaceable resources. The hunters of Barenthal had bloodied their prey, but they knew the prey would return in overwhelming numbers. As darkness fell on December 6th, Panther crews performed maintenance on their vehicles, while infantry reinforced positions. American artillery had begun sporadic harassing fire, forcing the Germans to keep heads down and movement minimal. The coming days would test whether the 11th Panzer could hold Singling against renewed assaults, whether German technical superiority could compensate for American material abundance. The crews settling into their positions that night understood what many strategic planners did not. Tactical excellence and superior weapons can delay defeat but cannot prevent it when the enemy possesses unlimited replacements and you possess none. The battle for Singling would continue, and the hunters would claim more victims, but the final outcome was never in doubt. The only question was the price. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, summer 1944. In a dust-choked testing range 3,000 miles from the nearest combat zone, American ordnance officers watched a demonstration that should have transformed their approach to armored warfare. A captured German Panther tank, one of the few complete examples to reach the United States, sat stationary at a range of 1,000 meters. Facing it was an M4 Sherman, the standard American medium tank, armed with the 75mm gun that equipped most American armored units. The test protocol was simple. The Sherman would fire armor-piercing rounds at the Panther's frontal armor, then the Panther would fire at the Sherman. What followed was not a test, but an execution. The Sherman's 75mm gun, firing M72 armor-piercing rounds, struck the Panther's frontal plate 5 times. Every round bounced off, ricocheting skyward with a distinctive whine, leaving only scratches on the hardened steel. Then the Panther fired once. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun, despite sharing caliber designation with the Sherman's weapon, operated in an entirely different performance category. The armor-piercing round penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor, passed through the interior, and exited through the rear plate. Had the Sherman been occupied, every crew member would have died. The test results were classified and distributed to senior officers with a bureaucratic notation that would prove prophetic. Technical characteristics of German Panzerkampfwagen 5 significantly exceed current U.S. medium tank capabilities in firepower and protection. Tactical implications require assessment. That assessment never materialized into meaningful change, not in time to save the men who would die at Singling and 100 places like it. The reasons were complex, embedded in American industrial philosophy, strategic assumptions, and institutional inertia. The Sherman tank had not been designed to fight German heavy armor in 1944. It had been designed in 1941, when German tanks were Panzer IIIs and IVs with armor thickness measured in tens of millimeters, not the hundreds that characterized later German designs. The Sherman specifications made perfect sense for that era, a reliable, easily produced tank that could be manufactured in numbers sufficient to overwhelm any enemy through sheer quantity. The technical disparity between Sherman and Panther told a story in cold numbers that no amount of courage could overcome. The Sherman M4A3, the variant most commonly fielded in late 1944, weighed 33 tons and mounted a 75mm M3 gun with a barrel length of 37 1/2 calibers. This gun fired a 14 1/2 pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of 619 meters per second. At 500 meters range, point blank in tank combat terms, it could penetrate roughly 60 millimeters of armor plate. The Sherman's own armor protection consisted of 51 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor on the frontal glacis, sloped at 56 degrees to increase effective thickness to approximately 63 millimeters. These specifications had seemed adequate in 1942. By late 1944, they were dangerously obsolete. The Panther Ausführung G, by contrast, represented a fundamental leap in tank design. Weighing 45 tons, it mounted the legendary 75mm Kokuk 42L/70 gun, the L/70 designation indicating a barrel length of 70 calibers, nearly twice the Sherman's barrel length. This extraordinary barrel length generated muzzle velocities of 1,000 meters per second, propelling 14-pound armor-piercing projectiles with devastating kinetic energy. At 1,000 meters range, the Panther's gun could penetrate 150 millimeters of armor, more than double the Sherman's maximum capability at 1/3 the range. The Panther's own protection included 80mm frontal hull armor sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness exceeding 140 millimeters. The turret front carried 110 millimeters of curved armor. In direct comparison, the Sherman needed to close to ranges under 300 meters and strike specific weak points to have any chance of penetrating Panther armor, while the Panther could destroy Shermans with confidence at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters. British forces had encountered these realities earlier than their American allies. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944, a single German Tiger tank commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed approximately 14 British tanks and 15 personnel carriers in 15 minutes, demonstrating the catastrophic mismatch between German heavy armor and Allied medium tanks. British after-action reports circulated through Allied headquarters with urgent warnings: current tank types inadequate for engaging German, Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, alternative tactics essential. Those alternative tactics included refusing direct engagement, relying on numerical superiority, calling for artillery or air support, and accepting unfavorable loss ratios as the price of operational success. American commanders receiving these reports faced an uncomfortable choice: acknowledge their equipment's inferiority and modify doctrine accordingly, or maintain aggressive tactics and accept the casualties such tactics would generate. The Sherman's most infamous characteristic emerged from its vulnerability to ammunition fires. American tankers called it the Ronson lighter, after an advertising slogan, "Lights every time." When a Sherman's armor was penetrated, the location of ammunition storage made catastrophic fires nearly inevitable. 75mm rounds were stored vertically in sponson racks on either side of the hull, directly in the path of most penetrating shots. A single armor-piercing round entering the crew compartment would frequently strike these ammunition racks, causing immediate detonation. The resulting fire could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius within seconds. Crew survivability depended on bailing out within 5 seconds of penetration, a feat possible only if hatches weren't jammed, if the crew wasn't already killed by the initial penetration, and if German machine gunners weren't targeting men attempting to escape. Studies of Sherman losses in Normandy and Lorraine indicated that 60 to 80% of destroyed Shermans suffered catastrophic fires, and crew casualty rates in burned-out tanks approached 90%. German tankers, by contrast, benefited from ammunition storage in protected areas below the turret ring, surrounded by additional armor, and equipped with blast doors designed to vent explosions away from the crew compartment. Panther crews struck by penetrating rounds had significantly higher survival rates than their American counterparts. This asymmetry in survivability compounded the technical disparity. Not only were German tanks harder to kill, but German crews were more likely to survive when their tanks were knocked out, preserving experienced veterans who could train replacements. American crews, operating inferior vehicles, faced higher casualty rates per engagement and lower survival rates when their tanks were destroyed. The mathematics of attrition favored Germany at the tactical level, even as American industrial superiority ensured strategic victory. The kill ratio statistics told the story with brutal clarity. From Normandy through the Lorraine campaign, American and German armor clashed in hundreds of engagements across terrain, ranging from Norman hedgerows to Alsatian plains. When German tanks, particularly Panthers and Tigers, engaged American Shermans, the results averaged 3.6 Allied tanks destroyed for every German tank lost. In some engagements, particularly defensive ambushes like Singling, the ratio exceeded 10-1. American commanders justified these statistics by pointing to operational-level success. German forces were retreating, German industrial capacity was collapsing, and American replacement rates meant that even unfavorable tactical exchanges contributed to strategic victory. But for the men dying and burning Shermans, strategic victory offered cold comfort. Alternative American tanks existed by late 1944, but remained rare at the front. The M4A3 with the 76mm gun offered improved penetration, but still couldn't match the Panther at range. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, with its 90mm gun and heavier armor, could engage Panthers on equal terms, but production delays meant only 20 Pershings reached Europe before Germany's surrender. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M36s mounting 90mm guns provided some capability against heavy German armor, but tank destroyers operated under different doctrine than tanks, designed for defensive operations rather than the aggressive advances that characterized American armor employment. The 4th Armored Division approaching Singling in December 1944 had no Pershings, few upgunned Shermans, and tank destroyer support that couldn't compensate for the fundamental vulnerability of their main battle tanks. The technical mismatch between Sherman and Panther represented more than engineering specifications. It revealed divergent philosophies about armored warfare. American doctrine emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, and mass production. The Sherman could be manufactured at a rate of 2,000 per month across multiple factories, shipped across the Atlantic, and maintained by crews with modest technical training. German doctrine emphasized technological superiority and tactical excellence. The Panther required specialized production facilities, extensive crew training, and sophisticated maintenance, but in the hands of competent crews in favorable tactical situations, it could achieve results far beyond its numbers. At Singling, these philosophies collided, and the immediate tactical outcome favored the Germans. But the broader strategic reality remained. Germany produced 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. America produced 49,000 Shermans. Quality versus quantity, craftsmanship versus industry, tactical excellence versus strategic inevitability. The afternoon light on December 6, 1944, held that particular quality of winter in Alsace, pale, cold, fading early. Lieutenant William Cowgill's Sherman lurched across frozen ground, 4th in a column of tanks advancing towards Singling from the south. Through his periscope, Cowgill scanned the approaching village, seeing nothing unusual. Stone buildings clustered around a church spire, bare trees marking field boundaries, agricultural land hardened by frost into corrugated iron. At 24 years old, Cowgill had already led Company A through months of combat, earning decorations and the trust of men who understood that their lieutenant's tactical decisions directly correlated with their survival. This afternoon's mission had been briefed as routine: advance to Singling, clear out whatever German stragglers remained from their general retreat, consolidate, and prepare for the next day's push toward the Siegfried Line. The intelligence estimate suggested light resistance, perhaps a company of infantry, maybe a few anti-tank guns, nothing the 4th Armored Division couldn't handle with its customary aggressive tactics. At 16:45 hours, Staff Sergeant Thomas Walsh's Sherman, leading the column, crossed an invisible line that German artillery observers had marked precisely on their maps. Walsh's crew consisted of 5 men who had trained together at Fort Knox, landed together at Normandy, and survived together through the brutal combat across France. Walsh himself, a 22-year-old from Pittsburgh who had worked in his father's steel mill before the war, commanded from the turret, head and shoulders exposed above the hatch because visibility through periscopes was limited, and combat experience taught that awareness mattered more than protection. His gunner, Corporal James Rivera, scanned the tree line through his telescope, searching for muzzle flashes or movement. The loader, Private First Class David Chen, stood ready with a 75mm high explosive round in the breech, standard procedure when infantry resistance was expected. The bow gunner and driver occupied the hull, their visibility even more restricted, relying on commands from the turret. The Panther that fired on Walsh's Sherman had waited in position for 14 hours. Its commander, Lieutenant Klaus Becker, had carefully selected a hull-down position among Singling's southern buildings, where only the Panther's turret was, exposed, presenting minimal target area while maintaining perfect observation of the American approach route. Becker's gunner had already ranged the kill zone using pre-positioned markers, white stones visible only from the German position. When Walsh's Sherman reached the 1,200-meter mark, Becker gave the fire command with professional calm. Panzer 12 Uhr, 1200 Feuer. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 gun fired with a distinctive crack that differed from the Sherman's lower velocity weapon, a sound experienced tankers could distinguish instantly. The armor-piercing round crossed 1,200 meters in approximately 1.2 seconds. Walsh died without understanding what had killed him. The German round struck his Sherman's frontal glacis plate slightly right of center, punching through 2 inches of armor as if through cardboard. The tungsten carbide penetrator continued through the crew compartment at supersonic velocity, fragmenting as it traveled, creating a cone of superheated metal that killed Rivera and Chen instantly. The round then struck the vertical ammunition storage rack on the Sherman's right side, where 37 75mm rounds sat in canvas bags. The detonation was catastrophic. 40 pounds of propellant and explosive filler erupted simultaneously, generating pressures and temperatures that human bodies could not withstand. The Sherman's turret, weighing several tons, lifted from its ring and flew 20 feet into the air before crashing down 15 feet from the burning hull. The driver and bow gunner, protected momentarily by the engine compartment, survived long enough to realize they were trapped in an inferno before smoke inhalation mercifully ended their awareness. The entire sequence from penetration to catastrophic fire took less than 4 seconds. Lieutenant Cowgill, watching from his position fourth in column, saw Walsh's Sherman erupt in flames with shocking suddenness. His first coherent thought was mechanical failure. Ammunition fires occasionally occurred spontaneously, a known Sherman vulnerability. Then the second Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Michael Ross, exploded in an identical fireball. Then the third. Cowgill's radio operator was screaming into the microphone, "Contact! Contact! Taking fire from," but couldn't identify the source. Through his periscope, Cowgill saw muzzle flashes from Singling, at least 3 separate positions, firing with rhythmic precision. His gunner traversed the turret, searching for targets, but at 1,200 meters the German Panthers were nearly invisible, concealed among buildings and camouflaged with local foliage. Cowgill fired twice at suspected positions, both rounds missing, before a hammer blow struck his own Sherman. The German round that hit Cowgill's tank struck at an angle, penetrating the turret ring where armor was thinnest. The explosion inside the turret killed the radio operator instantly. Private First Class Robert Morrison, 19 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa, who had been writing a letter to his mother that morning. Morrison died with the pencil still in his hand. The blast wave slammed Cowgill against the turret wall, breaking 3 ribs and causing a concussion that left him dazed but conscious. His gunner, temporarily deafened by the explosion, continued firing blindly in the direction of muzzle flashes. The loader, functioning on training and adrenaline, loaded another round despite the blood streaming from his ears. But Cowgill, vision blurred and struggling to breathe, understood they were in a kill zone with no effective means of fighting back. He gave the only order that made sense. "Withdraw! All units, pull back! Pop smoke and withdraw!" The withdrawal under fire lasted 6 minutes that felt like hours. Surviving Sherman commanders reversed their tanks, a maneuver that required the driver to navigate blind while the commander directed from the turret, all while German rounds continued to impact. One Sherman, attempting to turn, exposed its thinner side armor and took a penetrating round that killed the driver and jammed the transmission. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire, 2 making it to cover, 3 cut down in the open. Another Sherman threw a track while reversing, immobilizing the vehicle within the kill zone. Its crew had approximately 15 seconds to decide whether to attempt repairs under fire or abandon the tank. They chose abandonment, all 5 men escaping before a German round set their Sherman ablaze. By 1700 hours, the surviving American tanks had pulled back 800 meters and established a hasty defensive position behind a small ridgeline that provided defilade from German observation. The casualty count from those 15 minutes of combat required hours to compile. 5 M4 Shermans had been completely destroyed, turrets blown off, hulls gutted by fire, ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions that scattered debris across 50 meters. 2 more Shermans were damaged, one immobilized with track damage, another with turret damage that made the main gun inoperable. 11 American tankers were dead, 7 wounded seriously enough to require immediate evacuation, and 3 missing, presumed killed in tank fires that left remains unidentifiable. German losses, as far as American observers could determine, were 0. Not a single Panther had been knocked out, damaged, or even forced to displace. German infantry casualties might have numbered 2 or 3 from American high-explosive rounds that impacted near their positions, but this was speculation. The engagement had been utterly one-sided, a brutal demonstration of what happened when technically inferior forces met technically superior ones in unfavorable tactical circumstances. That evening, survivors gathered in a commandeered farmhouse 2 miles south of Singling, men sitting in shocked silence or speaking in low voices that occasionally cracked with emotion. Cowgill, ribs taped and head bandaged, attempted to compile an after-action report but found himself staring at blank paper, unable to articulate what had happened. How did you explain to higher headquarters that your company had been massacred without inflicting any damage in return. How did you describe watching men you had trained with, eaten with, and fought alongside for months die without being able to help them? Sergeant Chen, whose tank had survived by being positioned fifth in the column, sat cleaning his pistol with mechanical precision, hands shaking slightly. "We never saw them," he said to the room. "We never even saw them until they fired. How do you fight something you can't see and can't hurt?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, had just learned what British tankers had learned at Villers-Bocage, what Soviet tankers had learned at Kursk, what every Allied armored unit eventually learned when facing German Panthers or Tigers. Courage and aggression could not overcome technical inferiority. The Sherman, adequate against earlier German tanks, was dangerously outclassed by late-war German armor. American doctrine, emphasizing speed and aggressive maneuver, had worked brilliantly when German forces were disorganized and retreating. But at Singling, German forces were organized, prepared, and equipped with weapons that could kill American tanks at ranges where American return fire was ineffective. The men of Company A had just paid the tuition for this education. The only question was whether their commanders had learned the same lesson. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams received the casualty report from Singling at 2100 hours on December 6, 1944, and his fist came down on the map table hard enough to make the acetate overlay jump. Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, was 30 years old and already legendary within the armored force. Aggressive, profane, brilliant, and utterly committed to the offensive doctrine that had carried his battalion from Normandy to Germany's border. He had earned his reputation through battles that read like a case study in armored warfare. The Avranches breakout, where his battalion had punched through German defenses and raced into Brittany. The relief of Bastogne, where he would later lead the force that broke through to the besieged paratroopers. Dozens of smaller actions where speed and violence had shattered German positions. But Singling represented something different. Not a fluid battle where American advantages in mobility and combined arms could be leveraged, but a prepared defensive position where German technical superiority could be fully employed. The tactical problem Abrams faced was straightforward to state, but nearly impossible to solve with available resources. Singling sat astride the 4th Armored Division's assigned axis of advance toward the Siegfried Line. Leaving it in German hands meant accepting an unguarded flank and potential German counterattacks against supply lines. Higher headquarters expected continued offensive momentum. General Patton's Third Army was attacking along a 75-mile front, and every division was expected to maintain pressure regardless of local difficulties. But the cost calculation was brutal. Company A had lost 40% of its strength in 15 minutes. Renewing the attack with the same tactics would produce similar results. Abrams understood mathematics as well as aggression. 5 Shermans lost for 0 German tanks destroyed was not a sustainable exchange ratio, no matter how many replacement tanks were available. The telephone call to Combat Command A headquarters, 2300 hours on December 6th, revealed the tension between tactical reality and operational demands. Brigadier General Holmes Dager, commanding CCA, 4th Armored Division, listened to Abrams' assessment with growing frustration. "Crip, I understand the problem, but we can't just stop. Patton expects results. Third Army expects results. What do you need?" Abrams' response was blunt. "I need tanks that can fight Panthers on equal terms, and we don't have them. Failing that, I need overwhelming artillery support and infantry to get close enough to use bazookas. And I need time to plan this properly, instead of another hasty attack." The silence on the line stretched for several seconds before Dager responded. "You'll get the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion for support. Artillery will prepare fires on your schedule, but Singling needs to be taken tomorrow. Figure out how." The order's finality left no room for argument, but Abrams was not a man to accept impossible missions without planning them carefully. Throughout the night of December 6th to 7th, he worked with his staff to devise an approach that might succeed where the previous day's attack had failed catastrophically. The plan that emerged emphasized combined arms coordination, infantry advancing with tank support to suppress German anti-tank positions, smoke to obscure German observation, artillery preparation to disrupt German defensive positions before the assault. It was a sound plan based on established doctrine, the kind of careful coordination that armored infantry battalions trained for constantly. But everyone studying the map understood the underlying problem. Even with perfect coordination, Sherman's remained vulnerable to Panthers at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The plan's success depended on infantry closing to within bazooka range, under 100 meters, where the M9 bazooka's 2.36-inch rocket could potentially penetrate Panther armor. 3rd Army headquarters, 40 miles to the rear, viewed singling as a minor action within a broader offensive campaign. Duty officers tracking unit locations on acetate overlays saw one symbol representing the 4th Armored Division, not the individual companies and battalions fighting and dying at places like Singling. General Patton himself, meeting with corps and division commanders on December 7th, spent 15 minutes discussing the 4th Armored's progress and 30 seconds on Singling specifically. The operational picture from 3rd Army's perspective emphasized successful advances elsewhere. 7th Army units had reached the Maginot Line fortifications. Other 3rd Army divisions were approaching the West Wall. German resistance appeared to be cracking under sustained pressure. Singling's resistance was noted as heavier than expected, but not sufficiently significant to alter the broader campaign plan. The philosophy was simple: maintain offensive pressure everywhere. German forces cannot be strong everywhere. Breakthrough will come from sustained pressure, not from perfect local victories. But Abrams, studying maps in a commandeered farmhouse and listening to the distant rumble of artillery, understood that operational-level indifference to tactical-level casualties created a burden borne entirely by the men who would attack in the morning. Every military operation involves trading lives for objectives. This brutal calculus underlies all warfare. But the question that Abrams confronted that night was whether the objective's value justified the cost, and whether the cost was being inflated by inadequate equipment and hasty planning. Singling itself, a village of perhaps 200 people in peacetime, now largely evacuated, had no inherent strategic value. Its importance was purely positional. It sat along the division's axis of advance. Could the division bypass Singling, isolate it, allow follow-on forces to reduce it, while the 4th Armored continued its advance? Probably. Would higher headquarters accept such a decision? Almost certainly not. The decision to attack again represented the intersection of several pressures that had nothing to do with Singling specifically. Patton had built his reputation on aggressive warfare, on the principle that maintaining offensive momentum demoralized the enemy and prevented them from organizing effective resistance. His famous dictum, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week," reflected a philosophy that favored action over deliberation. The 4th Armored Division had internalized this philosophy, achieving remarkable success through aggressive tactics that kept German forces off balance. But Singling represented a situation where German forces were not off balance, where deliberate defensive preparation had created conditions unfavorable to aggressive tactics. The question was whether American doctrine could adapt to these circumstances, or whether institutional momentum would force continued attacks using methods that had already proven inadequate. Abrams, finalizing his attack plan in the hours before dawn on December 7th, made decisions that reflected both his aggressive nature and his responsibility to his men. He would attack because those were his orders, but he would attack with maximum supporting fires, careful coordination, and clear guidance to subordinate commanders that heroic but futile gestures were not required. Tank commanders were instructed to use terrain and smoke for concealment, to avoid presenting stationary targets at range, to coordinate movement with infantry so that bazookas could be brought to bear. Infantry commanders received detailed briefings on Panther vulnerabilities, the thinner side and rear armor, the vision blocks that could be targeted to blind the crew, the engine deck that could be attacked with thermite grenades at close range. It was professional military planning at its finest, taking inadequate resources and crafting the best possible approach given constraints beyond anyone's control. But as Abrams issued final orders at 0600 hours on December 7th, watching his company commanders absorb the plan and prepare to brief their own subordinates, he understood that planning could only mitigate risk, not eliminate it. Men would die in the attack, probably in numbers similar to the previous day's casualties. Some would die quickly, struck by Panther rounds they never saw coming. Some would die slowly, trapped in burning tanks or bleeding out from wounds sustained in the assault. All would die because American armor doctrine and equipment had not kept pace with German developments. and because operational-level decisions about maintaining offensive momentum translated into tactical-level costs paid in blood. The dilemma was inescapable: attack and accept casualties, or refuse and accept relief from command. For a man like Abrams, whose identity was bound up in leading from the front and accomplishing assigned missions, the choice was no choice at all. The moral weight of command, of ordering men into situations where death is not just possible but probable, is rarely discussed in military histories that focus on strategy and tactics. But in that farmhouse on the morning of December 7th, Creighton Abrams carried that weight visibly, his usual aggressive confidence tempered by the knowledge that he was sending men to fight with inadequate equipment against a better armed enemy. History would remember Abrams as one of the great American armor commanders, his M1 Abrams tank eventually named in his honor, his career culminating in service as Army Chief of Staff. But on December 7, 1944, he was simply a battalion commander with an impossible mission, doing his best to minimize casualties while accomplishing objectives that higher headquarters considered essential. The attack would proceed at 0730 hours, the 12 hours between the disastrous engagement of December 6th and the renewed assault scheduled for dawn. December 7th saw both American and German forces preparing with equal intensity but contrasting advantages. Company C 51st Armored Infantry Battalion received movement orders at 2200 hours on the 6th, rousing men who had been sleeping in barns and farmhouses several miles behind the front line. These were veteran troops who had fought through France alongside the 4th Armored Division's tanks, riding into combat aboard M3 half-tracks that offered protection against small arms but were vulnerable to anything heavier. The company commander, Captain James Mitchell, gathered his platoon leaders in a drafty barn and briefed the mission with characteristic bluntness. "Gentlemen, we're assaulting Singling at dawn. The tank boys went in yesterday and got their asses handed to them. Our job is to get close enough with bazookas to kill some German tanks so the Shermans can move up. Questions?" The silence that followed spoke volumes about what everyone understood but no one wanted to articulate. This mission had "casualties expected" written all over it. Private First Class Robert Hernandez, a bar gunner in 2nd Platoon, sat on his bunk cleaning his Browning automatic rifle, with the methodical attention of a man who knew his life might depend on the weapon's reliability. At 20 years old, Hernandez had already survived Normandy's hedgerows, where German machine gun fire had killed half his original squad, and the Moselle crossing, where German 88mm guns had turned the river into an abattoir. He had developed the veteran's ability to suppress fear through familiar routines, clean the weapon, check ammunition, write a letter home that would be mailed only if he survived. The letter he wrote that night to his mother in San Antonio was careful to reveal nothing that censors would delete. Still moving forward, weather is cold, food is adequate, mail from home is always welcome. What he did not write, could not write, was that he expected to die within 24 hours, that he had watched too many friends killed to believe in his own invincibility, that the BAR he was cleaning weighed 19 pounds and would be worthless against the tank armor they were being sent to fight. Across the frozen fields separating American and German positions, different preparations were underway. The Panther crews of 3rd Battalion, 15th Panzer Regiment performed maintenance on their vehicles through the night, working under blackout conditions that made every task more difficult. Lieutenant Klaus Becker's crew focused on the fighting compartment, cleaning the breech mechanism of their 75mm gun and restocking ammunition from the battalion's limited supply. Loader Gefreiter Hans Weber arranged 30 armor-piercing rounds in their ready racks, each round weighing nearly 33 pounds and requiring careful handling. German Doctrine emphasized ammunition conservation. Every round was precious, replacements were weeks away, and each shot needed to count. Weber's pre-battle routine included marking each round with chalk, recording the lot number in case ballistic consistency became an issue during sustained fire. It was the kind of professional attention to detail that separated elite units from average ones. German infantry reinforcements arrived during the night. Panzer Grenadiers from the 111th Regiment, moving into positions that overlooked the approaches American forces would have to cross. These were not green troops, but veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had fought at Kiev and in the Korsun pocket, who understood urban warfare and defensive tactics with the expertise that comes only from surviving. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Richter, commanding a heavy machine gun section, positioned his two MG-42 machine guns with interlocking fields of fire covering the open ground south of Isur, Singling. Each MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and Richter's crews had practiced ammunition changes until they could sustain fire for several minutes without pause. The psychological effect of sustained machine gun fire was as important as the casualties it inflicted. Infantry caught in the open by an MG-42's distinctive cyclic rate often froze or panicked, and panicked infantry were easy targets. American artillery forward observers infiltrated closer to Singling under cover of darkness, establishing observation posts that would direct the preparatory barrage scheduled for 0700 hours. Lieutenant David Goldman, commanding a forward observer team from the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, crawled to within 500 meters of Singling's southern edge and established position in a shell hole that offered concealment and some protection. Through his binoculars, by the faint light of a quarter moon, he could see German positions, the distinctive silhouette of a Panther's turret, barely visible above a stone wall, the sandbagged positions where infantry had dug in, the communication trenches connecting strong points. Goldman's radio operator set up the SCR 610 radio and established contact with the battalion fire direction center. At dawn, Goldman would direct 105mm and 155mm artillery fire onto the positions he was now marking on his map. If the artillery was accurate and if German positions were vulnerable to indirect fire, two significant ifs, the assault might have a chance. The temperature on the night of December 6-7th dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that water in canteens froze and men stamped their feet to maintain circulation. In the American assembly area, Captain Mitchell walked among his troops, checking equipment and offering words of encouragement that everyone recognized as inadequate to the task. Ahead, stay with your squad, use cover, and remember your training was solid advice but provided little comfort to men who understood they were being sent across open ground against entrenched positions. Some men wrote letters, others played cards with false cheer, a few prayed quietly. Private Hernandez noticed that several new replacements, boys who had joined the company just days earlier, sat silently, faces pale, understanding intellectually but not yet emotionally what combat meant. He considered offering advice, but decided against it. Nothing he could say would prepare them for what they would experience at dawn. German crews in Singling settled into their positions for the night, maintaining 50% alert, half the crew on watch while the others rested. The Panther's fighting compartment offered no real comfort. Temperatures inside the tank matched the outside air, and the crew slept in their seats or slumped against bulkheads, wool coats insufficient against the cold. But these minor discomforts were familiar to men who had spent winters on the Eastern Front, where temperatures reached -20 degrees Fahrenheit and German supply lines collapsed under partisan attacks and Soviet offensives. By comparison, Alsace in December felt almost mild. Becker, reviewing the day's engagement in his mind, felt satisfied with his crew's performance. 5 tanks destroyed, no ammunition wasted, position maintained. But he also felt the strategic futility that any intelligent German officer understood by late 1944. They could win individual battles, achieve favorable casualty ratios, demonstrate tactical excellence, but they could not win the war. The only question was how long the defense could continue before overwhelming Allied resources produced final defeat. At 0500 hours, American troops began moving toward their assault positions. The half-tracks rolled forward with engines muffled, as much as possible, though any German listening post would hear them approaching. Infantry dismounted at positions 700 meters from Singling and began moving forward on foot, using what little cover the terrain offered: shallow ditches, slight folds in the ground, the darkness that would last another 90 minutes. Platoon sergeants kept men moving, knowing that stationary troops in winter conditions would lose combat effectiveness rapidly. Tank crews, having slept in their vehicles, started engines at 0530, the roar of 34 GAA engines shattering the pre-dawn quiet. There was no point in attempting surprise. German listening posts would report the American preparations, and German commanders would prepare their response. The assault at Singling would be a direct confrontation of opposing forces, tactics, and weapons systems. Exactly the kind of battle where German advantages in equipment and prepared positions could be fully employed. As first light began to gray the eastern horizon at Sur, 06:30 on December 7, 1944, both sides waited in positions with contrasting emotions. American troops felt the anticipation mixed with fear that precedes combat, the dry mouth, the nervous energy, the knowledge that within an hour some of them would be dead. German troops felt the confidence of prepared defenders with superior weapons, tempered by the understanding that even victories were temporary, that the war was lost at the strategic level, even as individual battles might be won. The stage was set for what would become one of those small battles that history usually ignores. The kind of engagement that claimed dozens of lives, changed nothing strategically, but meant everything to those who fought it. In 90 minutes, the killing would begin. The American artillery barrage began at precisely 0700 hours on December 7, 1944, with a sound like continuous thunder rolling across the frozen fields. 12 105mm howitzers from the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired in coordinated salvos, their shells arcing skyward before plunging down onto Singling's buildings and suspected German positions. The heavier 155mm guns of Corps artillery joined seconds later, their shells producing larger explosions that sent debris flying in all directions. For 20 minutes, approximately 600 rounds impacted Singling, the carefully planned fires controlled by Lieutenant Goldman's forward observer team. Stone buildings collapsed under direct hits, fires started where shells struck wooden structures, and a pall of smoke and dust began obscuring the target area. American planners hoped this preparation would disrupt German defenses, destroy some Panthers, and create confusion that the assault could exploit. German defenders, sheltering in basements and reinforced positions, accepted casualties from near misses while waiting for the sieves. Barrage to lift. At 0750 hours, the artillery fire shifted deeper into Singling, moving off the southern approaches to avoid hitting advancing American forces. This was the signal for assault. Company C's half-tracks lurched forward, their tracks churning frozen ground as they accelerated towards Singling. The plan called for infantry to dismount 400 meters from the objective and advance on foot with tank support. But German response came almost immediately. The first Panther round struck a half-track at 600 meters range, the 75mm armor-piercing shell punching through the vehicle's thin armor and detonating inside the troop compartment. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and wounded 3 others, including the squad leader. Survivors bailed out into ground that offered no cover, some making it to shallow depressions, others cut down by machine gun fire from German infantry positions. The Sherman tank supporting the assault began, engaging targets at 0800 hours, firing on suspected Panther positions that were nearly invisible through the smoke and dust. Sergeant Thomas Chen, whose tank had survived the December 6th engagement, fired 3 high-explosive rounds at a building where he thought he had seen muzzle flash. But the return fire came from a different position entirely. A Panther, concealed in a prepared hull-down position, 300 meters from where Chen had fired, engaged his Sherman at a range of 1,000 meters. The German gunner, following Doctrine, aimed for the junction between hull and turret, a known weak point in Sherman design. The round penetrated, killing Chen's loader and gunner instantly. Chen himself, wounded by shell fragments, gave the order to bail out. His crew escaped with 3 men wounded and 2 dead, but the tank was a total loss, ammunition cooking off minutes later. Private First Class Robert Hernandez advanced through what the Army called fire-swept terrain, ground where bullets and shell fragments filled the air with lethal density. His squad had been ordered to close within bazooka range of German armor, a mission that required crossing 300 meters of open ground under observation. The squad leader, Sergeant William Morrison, led from the front, using hand signals to direct movement because shouted orders were inaudible over the battle's noise. They made 50 meters before German MG-42, in from Oberfeld-Weibel Richter's position, caught them in the open. The MG-42's 1,200 round per minute cyclic rate created what veterans called a buzzsaw sound, and its effect on unprotected infantry was catastrophic. Morrison died instantly, struck by multiple rounds. Hernandez dove into a shallow depression, his bar slipping from his grasp, and lay motionless while rounds snapped overhead. The American assault's critical moment came at 0810 hours when a bazooka team from 3rd Platoon, led by Staff Sergeant Robert Slattery, managed to close within 100 meters of a Panther position by using dead ground, a slight fold in the terrain that provided concealment from German observation. Slattery's team consisted of himself, a gunner carrying the M9 bazooka, and an ammunition bearer with 6 rockets. They had crossed 400 meters while under fire, losing 2 men in the approach, and now positioned themselves at the effective range where bazooka rockets could potentially penetrate Panther armor. The gunner, Corporal James Anderson, settled into firing position and aimed at the Panther's side armor, which intelligence reports indicated was thinner than the frontal protection. The rocket motor ignited with its characteristic whoosh, propelling the 2.36-inch shaped charge warhead at 90 meters per second. The rocket struck the Panther's side armor at an oblique angle, creating a flash of light and a cloud of smoke, but no penetration. The shaped charge jet, which should have burned through armor plate, instead deflected off the angled surface. The rocket's failure had multiple possible causes: improper angle of impact, defective warhead, armor quality exceeding specifications. But the result was the same. The Panther crew, alerted to the bazooka team's position by the rocket's smoke trail, traversed their turret and fired their coaxial machine gun. Slattery died attempting to reposition for a second shot. Anderson and the ammunition bearer retreated under covering fire from other squad members, having expended 4 rockets for no confirmed damage to German armor. By 0830 hours, the American assault had achieved a precarious foothold on Singling's southern edge. Infantry had fought into the first line of buildings, engaging German Panzergrenadiers in close combat that negated German advantages in firepower and preparation. Staff Sergeant Earl Thompson, commanding the remnants of 2nd Platoon, cleared a stone house room with grenades and rifle fire, killing 3 German defenders and capturing 2 wounded. For a few minutes, the battle's character shifted from the one-sided tank engagement to the close-quarters combat, where American and German infantry fought on more equal terms. But the Sherman tanks attempting to advance in support remained vulnerable to Panther fire. 3 more Shermans were destroyed, attempting to push past Singling's southern edge, their burning hulks marking the limit of American penetration. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, monitoring the battle from his command tank 500 meters south of Singling, faced the commander's eternal dilemma: reinforce success or cut losses. His battalion had already lost 8 Shermans in 45 minutes, and casualty reports from the infantry indicated 26 killed and 47 wounded. German resistance showed no signs of collapsing. If anything, it had intensified as American forces closed with prepared positions. The artillery preparation had failed to destroy any Panthers and had only temporarily disrupted German infantry. But American forces held a small portion of Singling. Withdrawing now would mean abandoning wounded, conceding failure, and having to retake the same ground later. Abrams made the decision to commit his reserve platoon, hoping that additional pressure would crack German defenses before American casualties became unsustainable. The battle for Singling's southern buildings continued through the morning in a confusion of smoke, noise, and close combat that bore little resemblance to the clean tactical concepts taught at armor school. Individual soldiers fought their own private wars, clearing houses, suppressing machine gun positions, treating wounded under fire, calling for ammunition and reinforcements. Private Hernandez, having recovered his BAR, provided covering fire for medics evacuating wounded from the kill zone, his weapon overheating from sustained fire. A Sherman managed to advance to the southern edge of the village by using smoke and covered movement, positioning itself where its 75mm gun could engage German infantry at close range. German Panzergrenadiers fought with the skill and determination of Eastern Front veterans, counterattacking American positions and defending every building with grenades and close-range small arms fire. By 10:30 hours, a stalemate had developed. American forces held approximately 1/3 of Singling, having paid for every meter with casualties. 28 American infantry lay dead in the approaches and streets, with another 53 wounded. 8 Sherman tanks smoldered in various states of destruction, their crews either evacuated, killed, or missing. German casualties, though lighter, were significant. Approximately 15 Panzergrenadiers killed, 12 wounded, and 1 Panther tank disabled by a lucky bazooka hit at point-blank range when American infantry closed to within 20 meters. The disabled Panther crew had evacuated their vehicle and withdrawn on foot, leaving the tank for American forces to claim as a minor victory. But the remaining German Panthers maintained control of the northern half of Singling and the commanding terrain beyond, their 75mm guns continuing to deny American armor freedom of movement. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, assessing the situation at 1100 hours, made the difficult decision to consolidate rather than continue the assault. His forces held a toehold in Singling, but could not advance further without prohibitive casualties. The capture of the disabled Panther provided some minimal justification for the operation. At least German armor had been engaged and damaged, if not destroyed. But the cost-benefit analysis was brutal. 65 American casualties and 8 Sherman tanks for perhaps 30 German casualties and 1 Panther disabled. The mathematics favored Germany tactically, even as American. Strategic advantages ensured such tactical defeats were sustainable. Orders went out to consolidate positions, evacuate wounded, and prepare defensive positions against potential German counterattack. The battle for Singling had reached an equilibrium of exhaustion, neither side able to dislodge the other without unacceptable losses. The aid station established in a captured farmhouse 500 meters south of Singling operated at capacity by noon on December 7, 1944. Captain John Reynolds, the battalion surgeon, worked without pause in conditions that would have horrified civilian doctors. A kitchen table serving as an operating surface, morphine supplies running critically low, illumination from Coleman lanterns that cast harsh shadows across wounded bodies. The seriously wounded arrived in steady procession, carried by medics or walking on their own if their injuries permitted. Reynolds performed triage with practiced efficiency, directing the walking, wounded to one corner, the seriously wounded requiring immediate surgery to the table, and those beyond helped to a quieter room where a chaplain offered what comfort he could. The surgeon's hands, steady despite exhaustion, worked methodically through procedures learned in medical school and refined through months of combat trauma, stopping hemorrhages, debriding burned tissue, administering precious antibiotics. Private First Class David Martinez lay on the operating table with burns covering 40% of his body, injuries sustained when his Sherman took a direct hit and caught fire. He had been the loader in Sergeant Walsh's crew, and against all probability had survived the initial explosion. His escape from the burning tank had taken less than 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds had exposed him to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Reynolds assessed the burns with practiced eye, 3rd degree across the back and arms, 2nd degree on the face and neck, airways potentially compromised by smoke inhalation. The prognosis was poor even with immediate evacuation to a field hospital with surgical capabilities beyond what a battalion aid station could provide. Reynolds administered morphine, applied petroleum jelly-impregnated dressings, and tagged Martinez for urgent evacuation. The private would survive to reach a field hospital 12 hours later, but his war was over, and his recovery would require 2 years of surgeries and rehabilitation. The dead presented different challenges. Graves registration teams, working methodically through the battlefield as German artillery fire permitted, attempted to recover bodies from destroyed vehicles and scattered across Singling's approaches. Sergeant James Mackenzie, leading a recovery team, approached the burned-out hulk of a Sherman with a combination of professional detachment and profound sadness. The tank's interior was a charnel house, bodies burned beyond recognition, metal fused with human remains, identification possible only through dog tags if those had survived the fire. Mackenzie's team worked carefully, respectful of the dead even in their urgency to complete the grim task, before German fire forced them to withdraw. They recovered 3 bodies from this particular Sherman, but 2 crew members remained unaccounted for, presumably consumed entirely by the fire or blown to fragments by the ammunition detonation. Lieutenant William Cowgill, released from the aid station with his ribs taped and instructions to rest that he had no intention of following, sat in a corner of the farmhouse dictating his after-action report to a clerk. The words came slowly, each sentence requiring effort to maintain professional detachment when describing the deaths of men he had commanded. At 16:47 hours, Company A engaged enemy armor positions vicinity Singling. Enemy fire proved effective at extended ranges. Company suffered 5 vehicles destroyed, 11 KIA, 7 WIA before successfully withdrawing to covered positions. The sanitized language of military reports transformed catastrophe into statistics, individual tragedies into casualty percentages. Cowgill's voice broke midway through the dictation, and he sat silent for 30 seconds before continuing. The clerk, a replacement who had joined the battalion 2 weeks earlier, typed mechanically, not yet experienced enough to understand what the numbers represented. The evening of December 7th, saw chaplains conducting makeshift memorial services for the fallen, abbreviated ceremonies that acknowledged the dead while recognizing that the living had no time for extended mourning. Captain Harold Simmons, the battalion chaplain, gathered Company A's survivors in a barn that served as temporary billets and spoke words worn smooth by repetition but still meaningful to those who heard them. "We commend to Almighty God our brothers who gave their lives in the service of their country. We pray that their sacrifice not be in vain, that we honor their memory through our continued service." The chaplain collected dog tags from the dead, each man's identity reduced to a stamped metal rectangle on a chain. Personal effects were bagged for eventual return to families: letters, photographs, wallets, wedding rings. Some items carried blood or burns, testimony to the manner of death. The letters that surviving tank commanders wrote to families of killed crew members represented perhaps the most difficult task of command. Lieutenant Cowgill, his handwriting cramped by bandaged ribs that made every movement painful, struggled to find words that would provide comfort without dishonesty. To the parents of Private First Class James Rivera, killed in Walsh's tank: "Your son died bravely in action against the enemy. He was an excellent soldier and valued member of this unit. His loss is deeply felt by all who served with him." What Cowgill could not write, was that Rivera had died instantly when a German shell penetrated his tank's armor, that his death was probably painless, that the fire that consumed his body had been so intense that identification was possible only through dog tags. These details would help no one, and military tradition demanded that families receive notification, emphasizing honor and sacrifice, rather than the brutal mechanics of death. The casualty statistics for December 6th and 7th told a story in numbers that resisted emotional interpretation. 37 American tankers and infantrymen killed, 54 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, 12 missing and presumed dead. Of the 13 Shermans destroyed during the 2 days of fighting, only 23 of the 65 crew members survived without injury. The Sherman's notorious vulnerability to ammunition fires meant that catastrophic kills, where the entire crew died, occurred in approximately 40% of tank losses. Wounded crew members often suffered severe burns, making their recovery prolonged and painful. German casualties, by comparison, numbered approximately 20 killed and 12 wounded, with one Panther tank disabled but potentially repairable. The kill ratio favored Germany by margins that would have been strategically disastrous if applied across the entire front. The psychological impact of these casualties extended beyond the immediate survivors to affect unit morale and combat effectiveness. Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, had lost nearly half its strength in 2 days. The survivors, many of whom had fought together since Normandy, grieved for dead friends while processing the traumatic experience of being trapped in steel coffins under fire. Combat exhaustion cases, the World War II term for what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, increased noticeably. Captain Reynolds treated several soldiers presenting with symptoms that defied physical explanation: uncontrollable trembling, inability to sleep, panic at the sound of tank engines. These men were not cowards or malingerers. They were victims of stress that exceeded human tolerance. Reynolds prescribed rest and reassignment to rear area duties when possible, but the battalion's need for experienced personnel meant most men returned to duty within days. The replacement system that kept American units functioning despite heavy casualties began operating immediately. Within 48 hours of the singling engagement, new tank crews and infantry replacements arrived from depot companies, men who had been training in rear areas or recently arrived from the United States. These replacements faced the difficult task of integrating into veteran units where cohesion and shared experience created bonds the newcomers could not immediately share. Technical competence could be taught. The veterans' situational awareness and emotional toughness that came only from surviving combat could not. Veteran soldiers viewed replacements with mixture of sympathy and caution. Sympathy because the replacements would soon face the same dangers, caution because inexperienced soldiers made mistakes that could get others killed. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, reviewing casualty reports in his command post on the evening of December 7th, confronted the arithmetic that every successful combat commander must master, balancing mission accomplishment against casualty preservation. His battalion had taken singling partially, but not completely, had inflicted some German casualties but suffered more itself, had demonstrated determination but also revealed the limitations of American armor doctrine and equipment. In any objective analysis, the engagement was at best a draw and possibly a tactical defeat. But operational-level warfare required accepting tactical setbacks that contributed to strategic success. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward the Siegfried Line continued despite Singling's resistance. Other units had achieved their objectives. 3rd Army's offensive maintained momentum. From this perspective, the 37 dead and 54 wounded at Singling represented acceptable costs for maintaining operational pressure. But for the families who would receive Western Union telegrams in the coming weeks, operational considerations provided no comfort. Mrs. Ellen Walsh of Pittsburgh would learn that her son Thomas, 22 years old, had been killed in action in France on December 6, 1944. The telegram would be followed by a letter from Lieutenant Cowgill, describing her son as a brave soldier who died serving his country. What Mrs. Walsh would never know was that her son had died in a battle that most military historians would never record, for an objective that was strategically meaningless, using equipment that was technically inadequate against the enemy he faced. Thomas Walsh and 36 other men died at Singling not because they lacked courage or training, but because American armored doctrine and equipment had failed to keep pace with German developments. Their deaths purchased a partial victory that was abandoned 5 days later when German forces withdrew on their own initiative. This was the butcher's bill that statistics sanitized, but families paid. The after-action review at 4th Armored Division headquarters on December 8, 1944, carried tension unusual for an organization accustomed to success. Colonel Creighton Abrams stood before acetate overlays marking Singling's approaches, defensive positions, and the locations where 13 Sherman tanks had burned in 2 days of combat. Major General Hugh Gaffey, division commander, listened with visible frustration as Abrams walked through the tactical sequence. Initial contact December 6th, casualties sustained, decision to renew assault, December 7th, further casualties, partial success achieving foothold in a village. The numbers were brutal: 37 killed, 54 wounded, 13 Shermans destroyed. German casualties, estimated 20 to 30 killed, 1 Panther disabled. The kill ratio was unsustainable, the tactical approach had proven inadequate, and every officer in the room understood these realities without them needing to be stated explicitly. The discussion that followed revealed the tension between institutional doctrine and battlefield reality. Gaffey, a capable and aggressive commander who would later lead the division through the relief of Bastogne, challenged Abrams's tactical decisions with questions that were pointed but professional. Why had the initial reconnaissance been insufficient to identify German armor strength? Could the assault have been better coordinated? Was artillery preparation adequate? Abrams, never a man to deflect responsibility, acknowledged planning shortcomings while emphasizing the fundamental problem. Sir, we're sending 33-ton tanks with 2-inch armor and 75mm guns against 45-ton tanks with 4-inch frontal armor and guns that can kill us at 2,000 meters. We can coordinate better, plan better, use terrain better, but we can't change physics. We're outgunned and out-armored, and tactics can only mitigate that disadvantage, not eliminate it. The intelligence summary circulated to 3rd Army units on December 10th provided the first comprehensive assessment of 11th Panzer Division capabilities. The document, classified confidential and distributed to battalion level and above, detailed Panther specifications with precision that should have been available before the engagement. Panzerkampfwagen 5, Panther, weight 45 tons, frontal armor 80mm hull and 110mm turret at steep angles creating effective thickness, 140mm plus. Armament 75mm, Kiki 42L/70, capable penetrating 150mm armor at 1,000 meters range, crew 5 personnel. Assessment: Panther represents most capable German tank currently deployed, significantly superior to M4 Sherman in firepower and protection. Recommend avoiding frontal engagements. Utilize superior numbers, artillery, air support, and combined arms tactics. The recommendations, while tactically sound, arrived weeks too late for the men who had died at Singling. Intelligence failures had multiple causes: German deception measures, Allied overconfidence following successful advances across France, inadequate aerial reconnaissance due to weather, and institutional bias toward optimistic assessments. Third Army intelligence staffs had known since Normandy that German heavy armor posed significant threats, but this knowledge had not been translated into tactical guidance that reached battalion and company commanders. The result was formations like Company A, 37th Tank Battalion advancing into prepared defensive positions occupied by superior enemy equipment without understanding the technical mismatch they faced. Ordnance officers visited frontline units in mid-December, collecting combat reports and examining destroyed vehicles to assess damage patterns. Captain Richard Stevens, an Ordnance Technical Intelligence officer, spent 2 days at the 4th Armored Division photographing destroyed Shermans, measuring penetration holes, and interviewing survivors. His report to Ordnance Department headquarters in Paris provided clinical analysis of why Shermans were dying. German 75mm KWK-42 produces penetrations through Sherman frontal armor at ranges up to 1,800 meters. No Sherman variant currently fielded can match this performance. Crew survivability in penetrated vehicles extremely low due to ammunition storage location and resulting fires. Recommend immediate priority to fielding Sherman variant with 76mm gun and wet, ammunition storage, and accelerated production of T-26 Pershing heavy tank. The broader pattern that emerged from reports across the European theater confirmed what individual units had learned through casualties. American armor doctrine required fundamental revision. From Normandy through Lorraine, American armored divisions had achieved operational success despite tactical disadvantages, compensating for inferior tanks through superior numbers, overwhelming artillery support, air superiority, and aggressive maneuver. But this approach generated casualty rates that were sustainable only because American industrial capacity could replace lost vehicles faster than they were destroyed. The 4th Armored Division's experience at Singling was replicated at dozens of locations: Aracourt, Metz, the Hürtgen Forest, where American tanks encountered German armor in circumstances that favored defensive positions and long-range engagements. Statistical analysis compiled by 3rd Army operations staff in late December painted a disturbing picture. American armored divisions in the European theater were losing tanks at rates 3 times higher than infantry divisions lost proportional combat strength. Tank crew casualties per mile advanced exceeded infantry casualties in similar terrain. When American tanks encountered German armor, particularly Panthers and Tigers, kill ratios averaged 3 to 4 American tanks destroyed for every German tank knocked out. These statistics were classified to prevent them affecting morale, but experienced tankers needed no statistics to understand they were fighting with inadequate equipment. The question was whether American command structure could adapt doctrine and accelerate equipment improvements before accumulating casualties became politically and militarily unacceptable. Field expedients began appearing across American armored units as crews attempted to improve their Sherman's survivability. Tankers welded additional armor plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles onto their Sherman's frontal armor, gaining perhaps 1 extra inch of protection. Inadequate against Panther guns, but psychologically comforting. Sandbags appeared on glacis plates and turret fronts, their actual protective value negligible, but their presence reflecting crews' desperation for any perceived advantage. Some units requisitioned concrete, pouring it into wooden frames attached to hull fronts, creating applique armor that added weight and reduced mobility without significantly improving protection. Ordnance officers discouraged these modifications, citing suspension damage and mobility reduction, but could offer no alternatives beyond suggestions to avoid direct engagements. Tactical modifications proved more effective than engineering improvisation. Tank platoon leaders began emphasizing smoke employment, using white phosphorus rounds to obscure German observation and allow movement under concealment. Combined arms, coordination improved, with infantry and tanks training together on techniques for suppressing anti-tank positions, while bazookas closed for short-range shots. Artillery forward observers were integrated more tightly with tank platoons, providing immediate indirect fire support when German armor was identified. These adaptations reflected professional military forces learning from experience, but they were adaptations to inadequate equipment rather than solutions to fundamental problems. The timeline for equipment improvements remained frustratingly extended. The Sherman with 76mm gun and wet ammunition storage designated M4A376W, was entering production in increasing numbers, but logistics pipelines meant it would not achieve numerical parity with 75mm variants until spring 1945. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which could engage Panthers and Tigers on relatively equal terms, had been delayed by Army ground forces, Commander General Leslie McNair's insistence on the tank destroyer doctrine, and skepticism about heavy tanks' utility. By the time McNair died in a friendly fire incident in July 1944, the Pershing program was months behind schedule. The first Pershings would not reach European combat units until February 1945, too late for thousands of tankers who died in Shermans during the intervening months. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, reviewing the various reports and recommendations filtering through division headquarters in late December, expressed the frustration shared by armor commanders throughout the European theater. In a letter to a fellow battalion commander, he wrote with characteristic bluntness, "We're being asked to fight Panthers with pea shooters. Every engagement costs us 3 or 4 tanks for every German tank we knock out. Our boys are brave as hell, but bravery doesn't stop 75mm armor-piercing rounds. We need better tanks, or we need to completely change how we employ armor. Current doctrine is buying ground with blood because we won't admit our equipment is inadequate." The letter was never sent. Command responsibilities required public optimism, even when private doubts were profound, but it captured the assessment shared by officers who understood both battlefield realities and institutional limitations. The Battle of Singling, in this broader context of reassessment and adaptation, represented both a specific tactical failure and a systemic problem. The engagement itself was small, strategically insignificant, and would be overshadowed within days by the German Ardennes offensive. But it illuminated with harsh clarity the consequences of sending technically inferior forces against prepared defenders with superior equipment. Every lesson learned at Singling had been learned previously in other engagements, and would be learned again at other locations across the front. The institutional response, after-action reports, tactical bulletins, equipment improvement programs, demonstrated professional military institutions' capacity for adaptation. But adaptation was measured in months and years, while casualties were measured in individual lives ended in seconds. The men who died at Singling paid the tuition for lessons that subsequent American forces would benefit from, but they themselves learned too late. The operations map at 3rd Army headquarters in Luxembourg showed Singling as a minor objective along a 75-mile front, stretching from the Moselle River to the Rhine approaches. Staff officers marking daily progress with colored pins noted the 4th Armored Division's partial capture of the village, without particular concern. The division was still advancing, casualties were within expected parameters for offensive operations, and the broader campaign showed favorable trends. Major General Hobart Gay, 3rd Army Chief of Staff, briefed General George Patton on December 10th with customary efficiency, spending perhaps 30 seconds on Singling. 4th Armored encountered heavier resistance than anticipated at Singling, suffered moderate casualties taking partial control. Division continues advance towards SAR objectives. Patton, studying the map with characteristic intensity, grunted acknowledgement and moved the discussion to logistics concerns and plans for exploiting anticipated German weakness. This operational-level indifference to tactical-level details reflected neither callousness nor incompetence, but rather the realities of commanding armies numbering hundreds of thousands of troops across vast frontages. 3rd Army in December 1944 consisted of 12 divisions attacking simultaneously, each division conducting multiple battalion-level actions daily. The casualties at Singling, 37 killed, represented roughly 0.13% of 3rd Army's daily casualty rate during the Lorraine campaign. Individual battles, unless they threatened operational objectives or consumed disproportionate resources, received attention primarily at division and corps level. Army-level headquarters focused on sustaining offensive momentum, maintaining logistics pipelines, coordinating with adjacent armies, and preparing for the anticipated final assault into Germany. The strategic picture that dominated Allied planning in December 1944 emphasized continued pressure against German forces to prevent them reorganizing effective defenses. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight Eisenhower commanding, had ordered broad front advances designed to strain German reserves and prevent concentration of forces. This approach contrasted with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's preference for concentrated single thrusts, the dispute reflecting different strategic philosophies about how to conclude the European war. Patton's Third Army, attacking in Lorraine toward the Saar industrial region, represented one axis of this broad front strategy. Success was measured by miles advanced and German units destroyed, not by favorable tactical exchange ratios at specific locations. By December 17th, just 10 days after the costly assault on Singling, the tactical situation had evolved in ways that reduced the battle's significance to near irrelevance. The 4th Armored Division, continuing its advance north and east of Singling, had outflanked the German positions and forced the 11th Panzer Division to withdraw to avoid encirclement. German commanders, despite their tactical success defending Singling, could not maintain the position when American forces threatened their supply lines and flanking positions. The withdrawal occurred during the night of December 16th to 17th, German forces conducting a professional retrograde movement that preserved most of their combat strength while conceding terrain. American forces occupied Singling without resistance on December 18th, finding destroyed equipment and abandoned defensive positions, but no German forces. The material balance between American and German forces illuminated why tactical defeats like Singling ultimately mattered less than strategic fundamentals. American logistics in late 1944 delivered approximately 500 replacement tanks monthly to the European theater, a flow that more than compensated for combat losses and mechanical breakdowns. German production, even with frantic efforts to increase output, could barely manage 100 Panthers monthly across all fronts, and German logistics struggled to deliver these tanks to frontline units given Allied air superiority and systematic destruction of transportation infrastructure. The 13 Shermans lost at Singling were replaced within 72 hours. The one Panther disabled there would not be replaced for weeks, if at all. Air superiority represented perhaps the most decisive American advantage, one that compensated for many tactical-level weaknesses. Allied air forces in December 1944 flew approximately 2,000 fighter bomber and medium bomber sorties daily over the Western Front, a level of activity that German forces could not match or counter. American P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and bombs, proved devastatingly effective against German armor moving in daylight. Panthers and Tigers, despite their superior armor and guns, were vulnerable to air attack, bombs striking thin top armor, rockets penetrating engine decks, strafing attacks killing exposed crews. German armored movement was consequently restricted to night hours, reducing tactical mobility and operational flexibility. At Singling, the 11th Panzer Division's Panthers had been effective because they fought from prepared positions where air attack was less effective. But such static defense ultimately failed when American ground forces outflanked the position. Artillery superiority provided another operational advantage that mitigated tactical setbacks. American artillery battalions supporting the 4th Armored Division could mass fires from multiple batteries within minutes, delivering hundreds of rounds onto target areas identified by forward observers. German artillery, by contrast, suffered from ammunition shortages that restricted fire missions to priority targets only. The artillery preparation before Singling's assault, while failing to destroy Panthers, had demonstrated American capability to deliver overwhelming firepower when required. Across the broader Lorraine campaign, American artillery accounted for approximately 40% of German casualties, a contribution that shaped operational outcomes even when individual engagements like Singling produced unfavorable tank versus tank exchange ratios. The numbers defining operational success told a story different from tactical level analysis. 3rd Army advanced 40 miles during November and December 1944, liberating hundreds of square kilometers and destroying or forcing withdrawal of multiple German divisions. These advances cost 3rd Army approximately 27,000 casualties killed and wounded, but inflicted approximately 40,000 German casualties plus massive equipment losses and destruction of defensive infrastructure. German 7th Army, defending against 3rd Army's advance, lost effective combat capability and required wholesale reinforcement to maintain even a thin defensive line. From an operational perspective, the offensive achieved its objectives, despite tactical setbacks like Singling. The 11th Panzer Division's fate illustrated how tactical excellence could not overcome strategic inadequacy. After withdrawing from Singling, the division was transferred to reserve and subsequently committed to the Ardennes offensive beginning December 16th. There, in Belgium's forested terrain, the division participated in initial German successes that created the bulge in Allied lines. But the Ardennes offensive, despite local victories, failed strategically due to insufficient German resources, Allied air power once weather cleared, and American reinforcements that contained and then reversed German penetrations. The 11th Panzer Division, which had fought so effectively at Singling, was virtually destroyed during the Ardennes fighting and subsequent retreat. By February 1945, the division existed only on paper, its surviving personnel absorbed as replacements by other units. Historical assessment of campaigns like the Lorraine Offensive requires balancing tactical performance against operational results. American forces, including the 4th Armored Division at Singling, demonstrated tactical weaknesses: inadequate tanks, sometimes hasty planning, casualties that could have been reduced through better preparation. But these tactical weaknesses occurred within an operational framework characterized by overwhelming material superiority, strategic cohesion, and institutional capacity for sustained offensive operations. German forces demonstrated tactical excellence, superior equipment, skilled commanders, effective defensive techniques, but operated under strategic constraints that made tactical victories ultimately meaningless. Germany could not replace losses. America could. Germany could not control the air. America could. Germany faced enemies on multiple fronts. America faced a single, contracting front. The broader question raised by engagements like Singling was whether American commanders correctly balanced operational success against tactical casualties. Could different tactics have achieved the same operational results at lower cost? Possibly. Could better equipment have reduced casualties? Certainly. But these questions assume decision-makers had perfect information and unlimited options, which was never the case. Commanders in December 1944 worked with available resources, imperfect intelligence, and pressure to maintain offensive momentum. They made decisions that produced casualties, including 37 dead at Singling, but also produced operational success that brought the European war closer to conclusion. Whether this cost-benefit calculation was morally acceptable remains a question that defies easy answers, depending on whether one privileges operational effectiveness or individual lives, a tension inherent to all warfare. The strategic irrelevance of Singling became fully apparent within weeks of the battle. By January 1945, Third Army was advancing again after defeating the Ardennes offensive. The Saar campaign resumed, and Singling was forgotten by everyone except those who fought there. The village changed hands twice more during subsequent German counterattacks and Allied advances, before finally being occupied permanently in March 1945. By war's end in May, Singling was simply another liberated French village, its wartime significance erased by the relentless progression of history. But for the families of the 37 men killed there, for the survivors who carried physical and psychological scars, Singling would never be strategically irrelevant. It was the place where they learned, at terrible cost, that courage alone could not overcome technical inferiority, that tactical excellence mattered less than industrial capacity, and that individual sacrifice, however genuine, might be forgotten by history even as it remained unforgettable to those who experienced it. The tape recorder clicked on in a small apartment in suburban Chicago, summer 1986, capturing the voice of a 71-year-old man who had spent 42 years trying to forget December 7th, 1944. Former Staff Sergeant Robert Hernandez, the Bay R gunner who had survived Singling's assault, sat across from a military historian conducting oral history interviews with 4th Armored Division veterans. Hernandez's hands, weathered and scarred, gripped a coffee cup with enough force to make his knuckles white. When asked about Singling, he was silent for nearly 30 seconds before speaking. "I can still hear them screaming," he said quietly. "The tank boys, trapped in those Shermans when they caught fire. You could hear them on the radio sometimes, if you were close enough, screaming for maybe 5-10 seconds before the ammunition cooked off, or the smoke got them. That sound, you don't forget that sound. Not in 40 years, not ever." The memories that Hernandez and thousands of other Singling veterans carried were not the sanitized narratives of official histories, but visceral sensory experiences that time could not erase. the smell of burning diesel fuel mixed with burning flesh, a distinctive odor that veterans could not describe without their faces tightening with remembered horror. The sight of crew members attempting to bail out of struck tanks, some making it, others caught by German machine gun fire or by flames that caught their clothes as they emerged from hatches. The physical sensation of rounds cracking overhead, the pressure waves from nearby explosions, the cold that penetrated everything during those December days. These were the details that defined the battle for those who fought it, details that rarely appeared in after-action reports, focused on tactical sequences and casualty statistics. The psychological impact of singling manifested differently across veterans. Some, like Hernandez, carried the memories as constant background presence, manageable through routines and deliberate focus on present rather than past. Others suffered more severe trauma that military medicine of the 1940s was ill-equipped to treat. Private First Class James Anderson, the bazooka gunner whose rocket had deflected off Panther armor before his team leader was killed, returned to the United States in spring 1945 with what his discharge papers called combat exhaustion. He spent 6 months in a veterans hospital receiving treatment that consisted primarily of rest and occupational therapy, then was discharged with a small disability pension and advice to put it behind you and move forward. Anderson struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, hypervigilance, inability to maintain employment, alcohol abuse. He died in 1972, age 50, liver failure related to chronic alcoholism. His widow told researchers he had never really come home from the war. The survivors' statistics told their own story about singling's human cost. Of the 103 men in Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, on December 6, 1944, only 29 completed their service without death or serious wound. 11 were killed at singling. Specifically, another 14 killed in subsequent actions before VE Day. 27 were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization, some returned to duty, others medically discharged. The physical scars, amputations, burn contractures, hearing loss, shrapnel wounds mark survivors visibly. The psychological scars were less visible, but often more debilitating, expressed through divorce rates that exceeded 50% among singling veterans, unemployment rates double the national average, and suicide rates that, while difficult to quantify precisely, appeared elevated in the decades following the war. A 4th Armored Division reunion in 1993 brought together approximately 50 veterans who had fought at singling, many meeting for the first time since the war ended 48 years earlier. The reunion organizers had planned social activities and guided tours of division battlefields, but the singling veterans gravitated together naturally, forming their own group that spent hours in quiet conversation. An observer noted the awkward silences that punctuated their discussions, moments when someone's comment triggered shared memories that words could not adequately address. When asked to pose for a group photograph, several men declined, explaining they did not want to be reminded how many were absent. The 17 killed at singling, the dozens more killed in subsequent actions, the survivors who had died in the intervening decades. The photograph that was taken showed middle-aged and elderly men with forced smiles, their body language suggesting discomfort with the commemoration. Lieutenant William Cowgill, who survived singling despite being wounded, returned to combat and was killed in January 1945 during the Ardennes counteroffensive. His parents received the notification telegram and subsequently a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Abrams describing their son as an outstanding officer who died leading his men. What the Cowgills never learned, what Abrams chose not to include, was that their son had struggled with guilt over the deaths at singling, had questioned his tactical decisions in conversations with fellow officers, had written in a letter to his wife that he could not shake the feeling he had failed the men killed under his command. Cowgill's death meant he never had to reconcile those feelings or process the survivors' guilt that burdened many commanders. In some ways, as several veterans later reflected, he was spared the decades of second-guessing that peacetime offered. The German veterans of singling carried their own psychological burdens, though from a different perspective. Lieutenant Klaus Becker, the Panther commander whose tank had fired first on December 6th, survived the war and returned to West Germany, where he worked as an engineer and raised a family. In interviews conducted in the 1980s as part of a German military history project, Becker described singling with professional detachment, the tactical situation, the engagement sequence, the effectiveness of prepared defensive positions. But when asked about his feelings regarding American casualties, his composure cracked briefly. "We knew we were killing brave men who were fighting with inadequate equipment," he said. "There was no joy in it, no sense of victory, just the professional execution of our woadies, and the knowledge that we had survived another day while inflicting casualties we wished we had not needed to inflict." War is not about joy. It is about necessity. At Singling, we did what was necessary, but that does not mean we did not recognize the human cost on both sides. The physical locations where Singling's casualties had occurred remained unmarked for decades, known only to veterans who occasionally returned to walk the fields where they had fought. Private Hernandez visited Singling in 2002, age 77, accompanied by his grandson who was studying World War II history in college. Standing in a field that had been the kill zone on December 7th, Hernandez attempted to explain to his grandson what had happened there 58 years earlier. "Right here," he said, pointing to ground now covered with winter wheat, "that's where Sergeant Morrison died. Machine gun fire caught him when we were trying to get close enough to use bazookas. And over there," pointing toward buildings 300 meters distant, "that's where the German tanks were. We could barely see them, but they could see us perfectly. They killed us, and we couldn't hurt them." His grandson asked why they had attacked under such circumstances. Hernandez was silent for a long moment before answering. "Because those were our orders, because we trusted our commanders, because we believed in what we were fighting for, because we were young and hadn't yet learned that courage doesn't stop armor-piercing rounds." The letters that Singling veterans wrote home during the war, many preserved by families and later donated to archives, revealed the gap between what soldiers experienced and what they could communicate. The combination of military censorship, desire not to worry families, and inability to articulate trauma meant most letters were superficial: weather, food, requests for packages, assurances of relative safety. But occasionally, especially in letters written immediately after combat before self-censorship and military censors intervened, raw emotion broke through. Private First Class David Chen, the loader who survived when his tank commander was killed, wrote to his brother in December 1944, "I can't tell you where we are or what we're doing, but I can tell you that war is not what the movies show. It's not heroic or clean or dignified. It's terrifying and ugly, and it makes you question everything you thought you knew about courage and duty. I've seen things I'll never be able to tell you about, things I'll never be able to forget. If I make it home, I won't be the same person who left." The letter was intercepted by censors and never mailed, found in Chen's personal effects after he was killed in February 1945. The recognition that Singling veterans received, or more accurately, did not receive, reflected the battle's official insignificance. No Medal of Honor was awarded for actions at Singling, though several Bronze Stars for Valor were presented. No Presidential Unit Citation commemorated the 4th Armored Division's performance there. No battle streamer for regimental colors marked participation in the engagement. From the Army's institutional perspective, Singling was a minor action within a larger campaign, worthy of after-action reports but not special recognition. But for the men who fought there, the absence of recognition felt like erasure, as though their casualties and trauma mattered less because the battle had not been strategically significant. This tension between official indifference and personal significance created resentment that some veterans carried for decades, expressing frustration that their sacrifice was forgotten, while battles like the Bulge received extensive commemoration. The comparison between American and German veteran experiences revealed different national approaches to processing wartime trauma. American veterans returned to a nation celebrating victory, where GI Bill benefits facilitated education and housing, where victory parades and monuments commemorated their service. But this celebration often included expectations that veterans would simply readjust to civilian life without acknowledgement that combat trauma might require more than time and goodwill. German veterans returned to a defeated nation, undergoing reconstruction and denazification, where military service carried stigma rather than honor, where economic hardship made veteran benefits minimal. Yet German veterans often found community among fellow soldiers who shared experiences that civilians could not understand, creating informal support networks that partially compensated for official indifference. Neither system adequately addressed the psychological wounds that battles like Singling inflicted. The question that haunted many singling survivors in their later years was whether their sacrifice had been necessary. The strategic irrelevance of singling, captured, abandoned, recaptured, ultimately occupied without resistance, suggested that the 37 men killed there had died for nothing. But veterans' perspectives on this question varied widely. Some maintained that every action contributed to overall victory, that singling's casualties had bought time and inflicted casualties that cumulatively mattered even if individually insignificant. Others expressed bitter conviction that the battle had been poorly planned, that better equipment would have prevented casualties, that commanders had sacrificed men unnecessarily to maintain offensive momentum, that operational-level commanders desired more than tactical-level realities justified. These divergent views reflected not differences in experience, they had all been there, but differences in how individuals processed trauma and found meaning in suffering. The final veterans of singling began passing away in the 21st century's first decades, taking with them first-hand memories that no historical archive could fully preserve. At their funerals, eulogies often mentioned their military service, sometimes specifically referencing the 4th Armored Division, rarely mentioning singling by name because families often did not know the specific battles their fathers or grandfathers had fought. The obituaries that appeared in local newspapers typically included a line like, "served with distinction in World War II," or "received Purple Heart and Bronze Star," sanitized summaries that could not convey the reality of December 7th, 1944. With each death, the living memory of singling diminished, transitioning from experience to history, from trauma to text, from voices to silence. The tape recordings made by military historians preserved some fraction of their stories, but recordings cannot capture the pauses, the hands that trembled holding coffee cups, the eyes that looked away when certain memories surfaced. The inferno that singling's veterans survived left scars that lasted longer than their lives, burdens they carried with dignity but could never fully set down. The lecture hall at Fort Knox, Kentucky, summer 1943, filled with tank platoon leaders fresh from officer candidate school, eager young men who would lead armored forces in Europe within a year. The instructor, a major who had studied armored warfare theory but never experienced combat, clicked through training slides showing Sherman tanks and aggressive maneuvers. "Gentlemen, the M4 Sherman is the finest medium tank in the world," he declared with conviction that only ignorance permits. "Speed, reliability, and overwhelming firepower deployed through aggressive tactics will defeat any enemy armor. Your mission is to close with and destroy the enemy through bold action." The slide showed a Sherman advancing across open terrain, turret traversing, the image of mobile firepower. What the slide did not show, what the major could not know in summer 1943, was that this doctrine would send thousands of men into battles like singling, where speed and aggression met, prepared positions and superior firepower with predictable results. American armored doctrine in 1943 and 1944 reflected institutional assumptions that proved increasingly problematic as the war progressed. The armored force, established as a separate branch in 1940, embraced cavalry traditions emphasizing mobility and exploitation over firepower and protection. This doctrine suited American strategic preferences, rapid advances to exploit breakthrough, emphasis on operational maneuver rather than tactical attrition, leveraging American advantages in mobility and logistics. The Sherman tank's design reflected these priorities: reliable, mobile, mechanically simple, producible in massive numbers. What it did not emphasize was the ability to win direct fire duels against enemy armor, an omission that seemed reasonable when German tanks were Panzer IIIs and IVs, but became catastrophic when Panthers and Tigers appeared. The reality check began in Normandy, summer 1944, when American armor first encountered German heavy tanks in significant numbers. After-action reports from units like the 2nd Armored Division described engagements where Shermans were destroyed, at ranges where their own guns were ineffective, where German Tigers dominated battlefields through firepower that American tactics could not overcome. British forces, engaging Panthers and Tigers simultaneously with American entry into continental Europe, circulated warnings about German armor capabilities. Montgomery's 21st Army Group issued tactical bulletins emphasizing combined arms coordination, artillery support, and avoiding direct tank versus tank engagements. But American doctrine, institutionally committed to aggressive armor employment, adapted slowly. The doctrinal contradiction was fundamental. Official combined arms doctrine emphasized infantry armor-artillery coordination, but operational practice favored tank-led advances that left infantry behind. The 4th Armored Division's success across France resulted from this aggressive approach, exploiting German disorganization through rapid advances that prioritized speed over consolidation. Tank commanders like Creighton Abrams became legendary for their ability to punch through German defenses and race into operational depth, creating chaos that collapsed German defensive cohesion. But this success created institutional momentum that discouraged adaptation when conditions changed. When German forces stabilized defensive positions and prepared to receive attacks, as at Singling, aggressive doctrine generated casualties that careful combined arms warfare might have reduced. The comparison with British armored doctrine illustrated alternative approaches. British tank units, traumatized by early war disasters in North Africa, where German anti-tank guns and armor had destroyed entire brigades, developed cautious doctrine emphasizing artillery support and methodical advances. British tanks would not move until artillery had suppressed enemy positions. Infantry and tanks advanced together from the start, rather than tanks leading with infantry following. Flanking movements and indirect approaches were preferred over frontal assaults. This approach was slower. Montgomery's advance from Normandy to the Rhine took 7 months versus Patton's 6. But British tank loss rates per mile advanced were significantly lower than American rates. Soviet armored doctrine represented yet another alternative, one that accepted horrific casualties as the price of breakthrough and exploitation. Red Army tank armies attacked in massive concentrations, accepting losses of 50 to 70% in breakthrough operations, while achieving operational penetrations that shattered German defensive lines. The Soviet approach reflected different strategic calculus. Manpower was abundant, time was critical, and political leadership demanded rapid advances regardless of cost. American and Soviet armies both practiced aggressive armored warfare, but Soviet forces operated at casualty rates that American public opinion would never have accepted. The question was whether American doctrine could find middle ground between British caution and Soviet ruthlessness. The institutional resistance to doctrinal change reflected multiple factors beyond simple stubbornness. Armor officers' careers had been built on aggressive warfare. Admission that aggressive doctrine was flawed threatened professional identities and institutional hierarchies. The Sherman's inadequacies were known at senior levels, but acknowledging them publicly risked morale and raised uncomfortable questions about procurement decisions. Moreover, doctrine based on aggressive mobile warfare had achieved remarkable success. France liberated in 3 months, German forces in retreat, victory seemingly inevitable. From this perspective, tactical setbacks like Singling represented acceptable costs within a winning strategy, rather than fundamental failures requiring doctrinal revision. The tactical adaptations that emerged from bitter experience showed professional military institutions' capacity for learning, despite institutional inertia. By late 1944, American armor battalions were issuing tactical notes emphasizing smoke employment, terrain exploitation, combined infantry tank assaults, and use of tank destroyers with 90mm guns against German heavy armor. These adaptations represented bottom-up innovation by combat units rather than top-down doctrinal revision, the kind of tactical evolution that occurs when survival depends on adaptation. But these changes came incrementally, filtering through command structures over weeks and months, arriving too late for units like Company A at Singling. The timeline of American armored vehicle development illustrated how slowly institutional procurement responded to combat realities. The Sherman with 76mm gun, offering improved anti-armor capability while maintaining Sherman's reliability and producibility, had been prototyped in early 1943 but did not reach combat units in significant numbers until late 1944. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, comparable to German Panthers in firepower and protection, was designed in 1943 but delayed by debates about its necessity, finally approved for production in January 1944, but not reaching Europe until February 1945. These delays reflected bureaucratic processes, production prioritization decisions, and institutional conservatism that favored proven designs over untested innovations. The cost was measured in thousands of tankers killed in obsolescent Shermans. Post-war analysis by the United States Army Armored School concluded that aggressive doctrine had succeeded despite, not because of, Sherman Panther disparity. The study, completed in 1947, acknowledged that American tanks were technically inferior to late-war German armor, but argued that operational-level advantages, air superiority, artillery, logistics, numerical superiority, had enabled tactical-level success despite unfavorable tank-versus-tank matchups. The recommendation was telling. Future American armor should emphasize technological parity or superiority with potential adversaries, ensuring that tactical-level competence was not undermined by equipment inadequacy. This lesson would inform development of the M60 tank series and eventually the M1 Abrams, vehicles that emphasized firepower and protection alongside mobility. The human cost of doctrinal failures and equipment inadequacies was quantifiable but often forgotten in abstract discussions of tactics and procurement. American armored divisions in the European theater suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, between June 1944 and May 1945. Tank destroyer battalions added another 13,000 casualties. These numbers represented individual tragedies: fathers who never met their children, sons who never returned home, husbands who came back physically or psychologically shattered. Some proportion of these casualties resulted from the Sherman Panther mismatch and doctrinal emphasis on aggressive tactics that exposed inferior tanks to superior firepower. Precisely calculating this proportion is impossible, but conservative estimates suggest thousands of deaths could have been prevented through better equipment or more cautious doctrine. The moral question underlying doctrinal analysis was whether speed of victory justified tactical-level casualties. American doctrine's emphasis on maintaining offensive momentum, accepting unfavorable tank loss ratios, and prioritizing operational success over tactical efficiency shortened the war, probably by several months compared to more cautious British approach. Those months represented thousands of additional Holocaust victims murdered, thousands of civilians killed in combat zones, thousands of Allied prisoners dying in German camps. From utilitarian perspective, accepting higher military casualties to shorten the war and reduce total suffering made moral sense. But this calculation required commanders to sacrifice men whose deaths might have been prevented, burden that men like Credit and Abrams carried even as they continued executing aggressive doctrine. The legacy of singling and armored doctrine was not the battle itself, but what it represented: the cost of sending technically inferior forces into direct confrontation with superior equipment. This lesson was learned repeatedly. Korea, where M26 Pershings and M46 Pattons faced Soviet-supplied T-3485s. Vietnam, where armored vehicles proved vulnerable to RPGs. Gulf War, where finally American armor achieved technological superiority. Each generation of armor officers studied battles like singling as cautionary tales about the consequences of equipment, inadequacy, and doctrinal inflexibility. The question that remained unanswered was whether institutions could learn these lessons permanently, or whether each generation would rediscover them through casualties that hindsight would recognize as preventable. Singling suggested the latter, that military institutions, despite professional education and historical study, tend to relearn fundamental lessons at the cost of soldiers' lives, rather than adapting proactively to changing threats. The tank that could have saved lives at Singling existed as a prototype in Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland in 1943, 18 months before the battle occurred. The T-26 heavy tank, which would eventually enter service as the M26 Pershing, represented American capability to design and produce armor comparable to German Panthers. It mounted a 90mm gun that could penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. It carried 100mm frontal armor that could resist Panther fire except at close range. It weighed 46 tons, comparable to the Panther's 45, and incorporated automotive components proven in Sherman production. In controlled testing, T-26 prototypes engaged captured Panthers in simulated combat, achieving results vastly superior to Sherman. Performance. The tank worked. It was available. It was not produced in time to matter. The decision not to prioritize Pershing production involved multiple factors, but primary responsibility rested with General Leslie McNair, commanding Army ground forces. McNair, a brilliant artilleryman who had shaped American training doctrine, held deep skepticism about heavy tanks. His philosophy emphasized the tank destroyer doctrine. Specialized vehicles with high-velocity guns would counter enemy armor while tanks focused on exploitation and infantry support. This doctrinal commitment meant McNair consistently deprioritized heavy tank development, arguing that Sherman supplemented by tank destroyers provided adequate capability. When presented with Pershing prototypes in mid-1943, McNair authorized limited production for testing, but refused to recommend full production, arguing that retooling factories would disrupt Sherman output without sufficient operational justification. The tragic irony was that McNair himself was killed in July 1944 by American bombs during the Normandy breakout, dying before witnessing how comprehensively his tank destroyer doctrine failed against German armor. Tank destroyers like the M10 and M18, despite mounting 76mm guns superior to Sherman's 75mm weapons, proved vulnerable to German fire due to thin armor and open-topped turrets. The M36 tank destroyer, mounting a 90mm gun, was effective against German heavy armor, but arrived in limited numbers too late to influence most combat. By the time McNair's successors reversed his decisions and prioritized Pershing production, the European war had less than 6 months remaining. The production timeline revealed how institutional inertia and bureaucratic processes delayed deployment. The Pershing design was finalized in March 1944, production approved in May 1944, first, production vehicles completed in November 1944, but shipping vehicles to Europe, establishing supply chains for spare parts, and training crews added months to deployment. The first Pershings reached frontline units in February 1945, 3 months after singling. Only 20 Pershings participated in combat before Germany's surrender in May 1945. Had production been prioritized in early 1943, when prototypes proved successful, hundreds of Pershings could have been deployed by December 1944. How many lives this would have saved is unknowable, but conservative estimates suggest several hundred American tankers might have survived battles like singling if equipped with comparable weapons to their German opponents. The industrial capacity existed to produce Pershings in significant numbers without substantially reducing Sherman production. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc plant, the largest tank production facility in the world, could have been partially retooled to produce Pershings while maintaining Sherman lines elsewhere. American industrial output in 1944 was producing tanks at rates far exceeding replacement needs. Monthly production of 2,000 Shermans against monthly losses of approximately 400. Diverting 25% of capacity to Pershing production would have yielded 500 Pershings monthly while still maintaining Sherman availability. The decision not to pursue this approach reflected institutional conservatism that favored proven designs over potential disruption. The cost analysis revealed that Pershing production would have been economically justified even with higher per-unit costs. A Pershing cost approximately $68,000 to produce compared to $50,000 for a Sherman, 36% more expensive. But Pershing's superior survivability meant lower replacement rates. Statistical analysis of tank losses suggested Pershings would be destroyed at roughly half the rate of Shermans in similar tactical situations. Over the course of a campaign, the total cost of fielding an armored division with Pershings versus Shermans was actually lower when accounting for replacements. Additionally, crew casualties, the truly irreplaceable resource, would be dramatically reduced. Training a competent tank crew required 6 to 9 months. Replacing lost tanks required days. The economic logic favored Pershing production even without considering the moral imperative of giving soldiers adequate equipment. The comparison with German tank development illustrated different approaches to balancing quality and quantity. Germany prioritized technological superiority, producing Panthers and Tigers with capabilities that exceeded Allied armor, but in numbers inadequate to achieve operational success. The Panther program consumed resources that might have produced 3 Panzer IVs, older design but adequate and reliable, for each Panther. German industry produced approximately 6,000 Panthers total, compared to American production of 49,000 Shermans. Germany's emphasis on quality meant individual German tanks dominated tactical engagements, but were too few to prevent strategic defeat. America's emphasis on quantity meant tactical disadvantages, but overwhelming operational superiority. The question was whether a middle approach, producing adequate numbers of technologically competitive tanks, could have combined both advantages. The British parallel showed alternative paths. Britain developed the Comet tank, with a high-velocity 77mm gun and improved armor, deploying it in limited numbers by late 1944. While not equal to Panthers, Comets substantially improved British armored capability. More significantly, British willingness to acknowledge Sherman inadequacies and pursue alternatives demonstrated institutional flexibility that American arms procurement lacked. British tank units receiving Comets reported dramatically improved performance against German armor, though numbers remained limited until war's end. The alternative history scenario, if 500 Pershings had been deployed by December 1944, reveals how equipment decisions shaped tactical outcomes. Statistical modeling based on Pershing combat performance in early 1945 suggests Pershing-equipped units suffered tank losses at approximately 40%, the rate of Sherman-equipped units in similar terrain and tactical situations. Applied to the Lorraine campaign, where 4th Armored Division lost approximately 150 tanks November through December 1944, Pershing deployment might have reduced losses to 60 tanks, 90 fewer destroyed vehicles, approximately 350 to 450 fewer casualties killed and wounded. These are estimates, subject to numerous variables, but they suggest the human cost of procurement delays. For Singling specifically, the tactical situation would have transformed dramatically with Pershing-equipped forces. Panther's primary advantage, ability to engage Shermans at ranges where return fire was ineffective, would have been eliminated. Pershings could engage Panthers on roughly equal terms, creating tactical situation where American advantages in numbers, combined arms, and artillery could be effectively leveraged. The 15-minute massacre of December 6th might have become a genuine tank battle with uncertain outcome. The desperate infantry assault of December 7th might have been unnecessary, replaced by methodical combined arms reduction of German positions with armor providing effective fire support. The 37 men killed at Singling might have lived, but they fought with the equipment available, not the equipment that should have been available. The personnel responsible for Pershing delays never faced accountability for their decisions. General McNair died in July 1944, before the consequences of his tank destroyer doctrine became undeniable. Other officers involved in procurement decisions continued their careers, some retiring with honors, none facing serious criticism for delays that contributed to thousands of unnecessary casualties. This lack of accountability reflected military culture's reluctance to assign blame for strategic decisions made in good faith, even when those decisions proved catastrophically wrong. The system that produced McNair's power to delay Pershing production, centralized procurement authority without effective oversight, continued largely unchanged into post-war period. The technical lessons learned from Pershing development influenced Cold War tank design. The M60 tank series, developed in the 1950s, emphasized firepower and protection alongside mobility, directly reflecting recognition that American tanks must match or exceed potential Soviet armor. The M1 Abrams, entering service in 1980, represented the fullest expression of post-World War II armored doctrine: sophisticated fire control, composite armor protection, and gas turbine engine creating platform that dominated Iraqi Soviet-supplied armor in 1991. The Abrams name honored Creighton Abrams, the battalion commander who fought at Singling with inadequate equipment, his legacy preserved in a tank that embodied lessons his generation learned through casualties. The irony was not lost on veterans. The American military named its finest tank after a man who had been forced to fight with inferior weapons. The moral weight of the Pershing delay, the preventable deaths resulting from institutional failure to provide adequate equipment, remained a subject historians analyzed, but societies rarely confronted. Families of tankers killed at Singling and similar engagements never received explanation for why their sons and husbands fought with equipment known to be inferior to enemy capabilities. The 37 killed at Singling represented a tiny fraction of total casualties attributable to Sherman Panther disparity, but each represented individual tragedy that better procurement might have prevented. The question of responsibility, who should be held accountable for institutional failures that cost lives, defied easy answers. Generals made decisions based on available information and competing priorities. Factory managers produced vehicles according to government contracts. Procurement officers balanced immediate needs against future requirements. The system failed, people died, and responsibility was so diffused that no individual bore meaningful accountability. This perhaps was the deepest failure. Not that mistakes occurred, but that systems producing preventable casualties faced no serious reform or accountability even after consequences became undeniable. The celebration of victory in Tees. Europe Day, May 8, 1945. Reached even the scattered remnants of the 4th Armored Division, now deep in Czechoslovakia, having advanced from Normandy to within striking distance of Prague. In cities across America and Europe, crowds filled streets in jubilant celebration of Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender. But in a displaced persons camp outside Pilsen, where Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, had established temporary quarters, the mood was subdued. The survivors of Singling, now only 12 men from the original company that had fought there 5 months earlier, heard news of Germany's surrender with relief rather than celebration. They had survived. The war was over. They could go home. But the absent friends haunted the moment, ghosts at the victory celebration. The final accounting of casualties revealed the war's terrible mathematics. In the European theater, American armored forces suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, operating tanks and armored vehicles. The 4th Armored Division specifically lost 2,151 men killed during their campaign from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, with another 6,000 wounded. Singling's 37 dead represented 1.7% of the divisions killed, a statistical footnote in the larger campaign. But for Company A, those 37 casualties represented 40% of the unit's strength on a single day, a concentration of loss that defined the company's wartime experience more than any other engagement. The Sherman tank, despite its technical inadequacies, had achieved its strategic purpose through sheer numbers. American forces deployed approximately 20,000 Shermans in the European theater during the war. German forces destroyed approximately 7,900 Shermans, a loss rate that would seem catastrophic except that American industry replaced them faster than they were destroyed. By contrast, German Panther production totaled 6,000 vehicles across all fronts and all years of production, with approximately 4,500 deployed on the Western Front at various times. Allied forces destroyed or captured virtually all of them. The Sherman won through attrition, through replaceable superiority, through industrial capacity that overwhelmed tactical excellence. But this victory came with a price paid by men like those killed at Singling. The fate of the German 11th Panzer Division illustrated how tactical success meant nothing without strategic viability. After withdrawing from Singling in mid-December 1944, the division was thrown into the Ardennes offensive, where it participated in initial German successes. But as the offensive stalled and then reversed, the division was systematically destroyed through combat losses and fuel shortages. By February 1945, the 11th Panzer Division existed only administratively, its surviving 300 men absorbed into other units. The Panthers that had dominated at Singling, either destroyed in combat, abandoned for lack of fuel, or captured by advancing Allied forces, ended as scrap metal or museum pieces. The German veterans who survived the war returned to a defeated nation, undergoing occupation and denazification, their military service now complicated by association with a regime recognized as fundamentally criminal. The battlefield archaeology of Singling, conducted intermittently from the 1990s forward, revealed physical traces of the battle. Metal detector enthusiasts and military historians located Sherman hull fragments buried in fields where tanks had burned. Excavation of one site in 1997 uncovered a Sherman's transmission and lower hull, the armor plate showing the punched-through penetration characteristic of Panther 75mm hits. More disturbing, skeletal, remains were found in the wreckage, incomplete, fragmented, representing crew members who had not escaped or been recovered. These remains, after forensic analysis, were repatriated to the United States for burial in Arlington National Cemetery with full honors. The ceremony, attended by family members who had waited 53 years for closure, provided some measure of resolution, though it could not erase decades of uncertainty about their loved one's fate. The memorial erected in Singling in 2004 consisted of a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of Americans and Germans killed in the battle. The dedication ceremony brought together elderly veterans from both sides, many meeting for the first time since the war. The encounter was awkward, former enemies, now old men, sharing coffee and stilted conversation through interpreters. But a moment of unexpected connection occurred when former Lieutenant Klaus Becker, aged 81, encountered former staff, Sergeant Robert Hernandez, aged 79. Through an interpreter, Becker expressed regret for casualties his unit had inflicted. Hernandez, after long silence, responded, "You were doing your duty. We were doing ours. The fault was not yours or mine, but belonged to the people who sent us to fight each other with unequal weapons." The two men shook hands, both understanding that reconciliation could not erase the past, but might provide some measure of peace for the future. The question of whether victory justified its cost defied simple answers. Germany's defeat ended the Holocaust, liberated concentration camps, destroyed a regime whose continuation would have meant incalculable suffering. From this perspective, every casualty contributing to that victory, including the 37 at Singling, represented necessary sacrifice for a just cause. But this calculation required accepting that some men would die in tactically flawed operations, with inadequate equipment, in battles that achieved no particular strategic objective. The tension between these perspectives, victory as moral necessity versus individual casualties as potentially preventable tragedies, could not be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Different people reached different conclusions based on whether they privileged abstract outcomes or individual experiences. The legacy of Singling in American military memory was one of near-complete obscurity. No campaign streamer commemorated the battle, no presidential unit citation recognized the 4th Armored Division's performance there, no widely read history devoted significant attention to the engagement. This obscurity reflected both the battle's limited strategic significance and broader patterns of how societies remember wars. The iconic battles, Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, receive extensive commemoration because they represent clear turning points or dramatic narratives. The smaller battles where most casualties actually occurred disappear from collective memory, known only to specialists and those who fought them. Singling's position in this hierarchy of memory meant that most Americans remained unaware the battle occurred, even as its veterans carried memories for the rest of their lives. The statistical summary of the 4th Armored Division's war provided context for Singling's place within the larger campaign. From landing in France in July 1944 to occupying Czechoslovakia in May 1945, the division advanced approximately 600 miles, engaged in 163 days of combat, liberated territories containing millions of civilians, and participated in the relief of Bastogne, one of the war's legendary actions. The division earned more decorations and battle credits than almost any other American armored division, its performance consistently rated among the finest in the European theater. But this excellence came at cost. 2,151 killed, 6,000 wounded, hundreds permanently disabled. Was this exchange ratio, a division's worth of casualties for 600 miles of advance and numerous tactical victories, acceptable? Military planners said yes. Some veterans agreed. Others spent decades questioning whether the cost matched the achievement. The individual fates of Singling's participants traced diverse paths. Lieutenant Colonel Craden Abrams survived the war and pursued a distinguished Army career, eventually serving as Army Chief of Staff from 1972 until his death in 1974. His legacy included fundamental reforms to Army structure post-Vietnam and recognition as one of the finest armor commanders America produced. But those who knew Abrams closely noted he rarely discussed specific battles, particularly those like Singling, where casualties had been heavy. When asked in a 1973 interview about his most difficult command decisions, he responded simply, "Every time I ordered men into combat knowing some would die." He did not elaborate, but veterans of his battalion understood he carried the weight of command decisions throughout his life. The broader lessons that military institutions extracted from the European campaign included recognition that technological parity with potential adversaries was essential, that doctrine must balance aggressiveness with force protection, and that casualty rates matter even in victorious campaigns. These lessons shape post-war tank development, tactical training, and operational planning. But whether institutions truly internalize these lessons or simply acknowledge them superficially before reverting to established patterns remained questionable. Subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, saw recurring instances of American forces encountering threats they were inadequately equipped or trained to handle, suggesting that institutional learning was incomplete or temporary. The human cost that statistics summarized but could not capture defined victory's shadow. Behind every casualty figure was a family that received a telegram, a community that lost a young man, a widow who raised children alone, parents who buried their son. The 37 killed at Singling left behind 17 widows, 23 fatherless children, 74 grieving parents, and uncounted siblings, friends, and relatives whose lives were permanently altered. These human consequences rippled through decades. Children who grew up without fathers, marriages destroyed by trauma, careers derailed by wounds physical and psychological. Victory in Europe was absolute and unquestionable, Nazi Germany's defeat necessary and just. But for those who paid victory's price, or whose families paid it, the shadow cast by loss remained long after the celebrations ended and the victory monuments were erected. The official history of the 4th Armored Division, published by the Army in 1946, devoted exactly 137 words to the Battle of Singling. Sandwiched between descriptions of the Metz campaign and preparations for the relief of Bastogne, the passage read, "On 6-7 December 1904, Combat Command engaged German forces in and around Singling. Despite determined enemy resistance from elements of 11th Panzer Division, American forces secured their objectives after heavy fighting. Casualties were moderate. The division continued its advance toward the Saar River." 137 words to summarize 2 days of combat, 13 destroyed tanks, 37 dead, and 54 wounded. The sanitized language, heavy fighting, moderate casualties, transformed trauma into bureaucratic prose, individual deaths into tactical summaries. This bureaucratic amnesia reflected broader patterns of how institutions memorialize warfare. The Army's historical apparatus focused on campaigns and operational-level actions that demonstrated clear strategic significance. Normandy received volumes of analysis. The Bulge merited extensive study. The drive across Germany was chronicled in detail, but the thousands of small engagements like Singling, tactically significant to those who fought them, strategically insignificant to the campaign's outcome, received cursory treatment or were omitted entirely. The historian who wrote the official division history faced constraints, limited space, focus on command decisions rather than tactical details, emphasis on achievements over costs. Singling fit awkwardly into this framework, difficult to describe as achievement given the casualties, too small to merit extended analysis, easier to summarize briefly and move forward. The veterans themselves struggled to preserve Singling's memory within the 4th Armored Division's larger story. At the division's annual reunions, beginning in the late 1940s and continuing for decades, Singling veterans would gather, informally, to share memories and commemorate fallen comrades. But these gatherings existed on the reunion's margins, unofficial sessions that younger division members, those who joined after Singling or fought in different sectors, rarely attended. Over time, as the division's membership aged and died, Singling's presence at reunions diminished. By the 1990s, fewer than 20 Singling veterans attended reunions, their numbers thinning with each year. By the 2000s, only a handful remained. Elderly men whose memories of December 1944 remained vivid even as recent events faded. The contrast between battles that entered public consciousness and those that disappeared revealed much about how societies construct military memory. Normandy beaches hosted millions of visitors annually, drawn by the invasion's undeniable historical significance and powerful symbolism of liberation. The Bulge received extensive commemoration, its dramatic narrative of desperate defense and eventual victory, fitting cultural preferences for clear story arcs. But Singling's fields, where American tanks had burned and men had died, remained unmarked farmland known only to locals and the handful of military history enthusiasts who researched obscure engagements. No tour buses stopped at Singling, no museums documented the battle, no annual ceremonies commemorated the casualties. The battle had vanished from public memory even as it remained central to survivors' personal histories. The German side of Singling's memory proved equally fragmentary. 11th Panzer Division veterans, organized in various Kameradschaft associations in post-war Germany, preserved unit history through newsletters and occasional reunions. The division's war diary, captured by American forces and eventually deposited in military archives, provided German perspective on the battle. Some German veterans published memoirs that mentioned Singling, though usually briefly as one engagement among many. But German military memory, in post-war decades, carried complications absent from Allied remembrance: association with a defeated regime whose crimes became undeniable, reluctance to glorify military service that had supported Nazi Germany, and younger generations' ambivalence about their fathers' wartime roles. German veterans remembered Singling, but their remembrance existed in private spaces rather than public commemoration. The archival record preserved documentation that individual memory could not maintain. Unit after-action reports, casualty rosters, maps, and operational orders resided in National Archives facilities, available to researchers but rarely consulted. These documents provided facts, dates, times, units involved, casualties, but lacked the emotional content that veterans' memories contained. Reading an after-action report that stated, 0645 hours, enemy tank fire received from Singling resulted in 5 M4 tanks destroyed, 11 KIA, 7 DIA, conveyed information but not experience. The terror of being under fire, the sound of men screaming and burning tanks, the physical sensation of cold and fear, these could not be captured in official records. The archival preservation ensured historians could reconstruct Singling's tactical sequence, but it could not preserve what the battle felt like to those who fought it. The few historians who studied Singling discovered it through tangential research rather than the battle's inherent significance. A German military historian researching 11th Panzer Division operations mentioned Singling in a 1993 article about Panther tank effectiveness, noting the favorable kill ratios achieved there. An American researcher studying 4th Armored Division operations included brief Singling analysis in a 1997 dissertation on American armored doctrine. A French local historian investigating World War II battles in Alsace devoted a chapter to Singling in a 2001 book published regionally. These scattered treatments prevented Singling from disappearing entirely from historical record, but none achieved widespread readership. The battle remained known to specialists, unknown to general public. The generational transition in military memory created tension between veterans' experiences and descendants' understanding. Children and grandchildren of Singling veterans often knew their fathers or grandfathers had fought in World War II, but possessed limited knowledge of specific battles or experiences. Many veterans had never discussed their service in detail, the combination of trauma and cultural expectations about stoicism creating silence that families did not breach. When veterans died, their specific memories died with them, leaving descendants with fragmentary knowledge, a Bronze Star certificate in a drawer, faded photographs in uniform, occasional references to serving with the 4th Armored, but little detail about what that service entailed. Some descendants researched their relatives' service after their deaths, discovering through casualty records and unit histories that their grandfather or father had fought at Singling. These discoveries sometimes prompted efforts to visit the battlefield or connect with other families, small-scale memory work that could not reverse broader forgetting but preserved individual connections to the past. The absence of physical markers at Singling exemplified how battles disappeared from landscape. Unlike Normandy beaches with their monuments and museums, or Bastogne with its memorial to the Bulge, Singling offered no indication that significant combat had occurred there. The fields where tanks burned in December 1944 were plowed and planted annually, agriculture erasing physical traces of warfare. Buildings damaged in the battle were repaired or replaced. The local population, which had fled during combat, returned and resumed normal life. French residents born after 1945 grew up in Singling without necessarily knowing the battle's details, aware vaguely that Americans and Germans had fought there during the war, but lacking specific knowledge. It was not that locals were indifferent. When researchers or veterans visited, residents were often welcoming and curious, but simply that Singling was one of hundreds of French villages where war had passed through, and institutional resources for commemoration were limited. The small memorial erected in Singling in 2004 resulted from private initiative rather than official commemoration. A French-American Friendship Association, working with Singling's mayor and local history enthusiasts, raised funds for a granite monument inscribed with the names of American and German casualties. The monument, standing in a small park near the village church, represented local effort to acknowledge what broader society had forgotten. The dedication ceremony in June 2004 brought approximately 40 attendees, a dozen elderly veterans, local officials, and handful of journalists from regional newspapers. The ceremony received no national media coverage, no official representatives from American or German governments, no crowds. It was intimate rather than grand, commemoration on a scale matching the battle's historical significance rather than its personal meaning to those affected. The question of whether minor battles like Singling deserved commemoration, comparable to major engagements, reflected deeper issues about whose sacrifices societies choose to honor. The 37 men killed at Singling died serving their country in circumstances every bit as challenging as those faced by soldiers at Normandy or the Bulge. Their courage, their suffering, and their loss were equivalent. But societal resources for commemoration are finite, and choices must be made about which battles receive monuments, which names are inscribed on memorials, which stories are told to subsequent generations. The result was hierarchy of memory that privileged iconic battles over routine ones, strategic significance over individual sacrifice. This hierarchy was probably inevitable and perhaps even necessary, but it created injustice. Some deaths were honored publicly while others were forgotten, not because the forgotten were less worthy, but because their deaths occurred in battles that history judged less significant. The final years of Singling veterans' lives saw various attempts to ensure their experiences would not be completely lost. Some participated in oral history projects conducted by libraries, universities, or military museums. Others wrote memoirs, usually for family rather than publication, documenting their service for descendants who might someday want to know. A few appeared at schools to discuss World War II with students, though these appearances rarely mentioned Singling specifically, focusing instead on broader themes of service and sacrifice. These efforts preserved fragments of memory, but could not overcome the fundamental reality that living memory, the direct transmission of experience from participant to listener, ends when the last participant dies. Singling's living memory was ending, transitioning to history, from experience to text, from presence to absence. With each veteran's death, Singling receded further into past, becoming not something remembered, but something researched, not lived experience, but historical event. The pattern repeated in Korea, June 1950, when American M24 Chaffee light tanks encountered Soviet-supplied T-3485s north of Seoul. The Chafees, designed for reconnaissance with thin armor and a 75mm gun, faced T-34s mounting 85mm guns. Behind sloped armor, the Chafees could not penetrate at combat ranges. American tank crews died in the same one-sided engagements that had characterized Singling. 6 years earlier, outgunned, out-armored, unable to fight back effectively. The after-action reports used different terminology and referenced different weapon systems, but the fundamental pattern was identical. Technically inferior forces meeting technically superior ones in circumstances that converted tactical engagements into executions. The lesson that should have been learned at Singling, that American forces must not enter combat with equipment inferior to potential adversaries, was relearned in Korean blood. The institutional response to Korea demonstrated both learning and limitation. The Army rushed M6 Pershings and M46 Pattons to Korea, finally providing American tankers with weapons that could engage T-34s on equal terms. The improved tanks arrived within months, dramatically faster than the 2-year delay between identifying Sherman inadequacy and deploying Pershings in World War II. This acceleration suggested institutional memory had retained some lessons from the earlier conflict. But the fact that American forces entered Korea with inadequate armor demonstrated that institutional memory was incomplete, procurement had not maintained technological parity during the 5 years between wars, leaving frontline units to discover equipment inadequacies through casualties rather than preventing those casualties through proactive modernization. Vietnam presented the pattern in different form. The M113 armored personnel carrier, designed to transport infantry with protection against small arms, proved devastatingly vulnerable to RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces employed extensively. The M113's aluminum armor, adequate against rifle fire, offered no protection against shaped-charge warheads. American mechanized infantry suffered casualties inside vehicles that were supposed to protect them, discovering, as Singling's tankers had discovered, that armor inadequate to the threat was worse than no armor because it created false sense of security. The solution, again implemented after rather than before casualties accumulated, involved additional armor kits, modified tactics, and eventually new vehicles. But the delay between threat identification and solution deployment measured months to years, during which soldiers died in vehicles known to be vulnerable. The Gulf War in 1991 finally demonstrated American technological superiority in armored warfare. M1 Abrams tanks, equipped with composite armor and 120mm guns, dominated Iraqi T-72s in engagements that reversed the Sherman Panther dynamic. American tanks destroyed Iraqi armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective, achieving kill ratios exceeding 100-to-1 in some engagements. This overwhelming advantage resulted from 3 decades of sustained investment in armor technology, driven partly by institutional memory of World War II and Korean inadequacies. The Tsu. Abrams represented what the Pershing should have been in 1944, a tank that gave American crews technological parity or superiority rather than requiring them to compensate for equipment deficiencies through courage and numbers. But even the Gulf War's success carried echoes of Singling's lessons about institutional adaptation speed. The Abrams had entered service in 1980, 11 years before the Gulf War, after a development program spanning the 1970s. This timeline, approximately 15 years from threat identification to fielding solution, remained consistent across generations. Whether responding to German Panthers, Soviet T-34s, or potential Soviet T-64s and T-70s, American procurement required approximately 15 years to develop, test, produce, and field competitive systems. This consistency suggested institutional limitations were structural rather than incidental, embedded in bureaucratic processes and development cycles that resisted acceleration even when casualties demonstrated urgent need. The Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts of the 2000s provided yet another iteration of the pattern. Improvised explosive devices proved devastatingly effective against Humvees, lightly armored vehicles designed for transportation rather than combat. American forces suffered thousands of casualties from IEDs, prompting urgent development and fielding of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles with V-shaped hulls designed to deflect blast effects. The MRAP program, driven by casualty rates and political pressure, accelerated production and deployment. First vehicles reached theater within 18 months of program initiation. This represented faster institutional response than previous conflicts, suggesting some capacity for learning. But the fact that American forces had entered Iraq and Afghanistan with vehicles inadequate to the threat demonstrated that institutional memory still failed to anticipate requirements before casualties forced adaptation. The statistical pattern across these conflicts revealed remarkable consistency. When American forces encountered threats for which they were inadequately equipped, casualty rates spiked until institutional response provided solutions. The time lag between casualty spike and solution deployment averaged 18 to 36 months across conflicts, regardless of specific threat or solution. This consistency suggested the bottleneck was institutional: procurement processes, testing requirements, production capacity, logistics pipelines, rather than technical capability. American industry and engineering could produce solutions relatively quickly when mobilized, but mobilization required casualties to generate political and institutional urgency. The preventable casualties during mobilization lag represented the cost of institutional structures that responded to problems rather than anticipating them. The comparison with adversaries' adaptation timelines illuminated different institutional cultures. German forces in World War II identified Sherman vulnerabilities within weeks of encountering them and adjusted tactics to exploit those vulnerabilities. Soviet forces in Afghanistan identified Mujahideen anti-armor tactics and developed countermeasures within months. Insurgent forces in Iraq modified IED designs in response to American countermeasures, with cycles measured in weeks. These rapid adaptations reflected different organizational structures: smaller forces with shorter decision cycles, tactical innovation emerging from field commanders rather than centralized bureaucracies, willingness to accept risk in testing unproven solutions. American military's size and institutional complexity, while providing enormous advantages in resources and sustainability, created inertia that slowed adaptation even when lives depended on speed. The theoretical understanding of this challenge existed at senior levels. Numerous studies, commission reports, and strategic documents acknowledged the need for faster adaptation and proactive threat assessment. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, established partly to prevent technological surprise, worked to identify emerging threats before they materialized. The Army's Training and Doctrine Command conducted threat assessments and future warfare studies. Multiple programs aimed to accelerate acquisition cycles. Yet despite this theoretical understanding and institutional infrastructure, the pattern persisted. American forces repeatedly encountered threats they were inadequately prepared for, adapted through casualties and urgent programs, then allowed preparedness to degrade during peacetime until the next conflict revealed new gaps. Singling's place in this broader pattern was as exemplar rather than exception. The specific details differed: Shermans versus Panthers instead of Humvees versus IEDs, Alsatian fields instead of Iraqi roads. But the fundamental dynamic remained constant. Institutional structures designed to prevent disasters through careful planning and risk mitigation instead created disasters by responding too slowly to evolving threats. Soldiers paid the cost through deaths and wounds that proactive adaptation might have prevented. The question that remained unanswered across 7 decades was whether this pattern was inherent to large military institutions, or whether structural reforms could enable faster adaptation without sacrificing the careful assessment and testing that prevented different types of failures. The moral dimension of this pattern involved questions of responsibility and accountability that institutions struggled to address. When soldiers died due to inadequate equipment, who bore responsibility? The procurement officers who specified requirements based on existing threats rather than potential future ones? The budget officials who allocated resources to competing priorities? The strategic planners who failed to anticipate threat evolution? The tactical commanders who employed inadequate equipment aggressively rather than adapting doctrine to equipment limitations? The political leadership that constrained military budgets or demanded results without providing resources? Responsibility diffused across so many actors and decisions that accountability became meaningless, creating systems where preventable casualties generated after-action reports and lessons learned documents, but rarely generated consequences for these whose decisions had contributed to the failures. The lessons that should have been learned from singling, that technological inferiority kills soldiers, that procurement must anticipate threats rather than respond to them, that institutional adaptation speed matters as much as ultimate capability, were documented, studied, and incorporated into doctrine. Yet each generation seemed to relearn these lessons through casualties rather than internalizing them sufficiently to prevent repetition. This suggested the problem was not ignorance, but rather the gap between knowledge and implementation, between what institutions understood theoretically and what they accomplished practically. Closing this gap would require structural changes to procurement processes, cultural changes to institutional risk tolerance, and political changes to how military preparedness was resourced, changes far more fundamental than simply remembering the lessons of battles like singling. The veterans of these various conflicts, singling survivors, Korean tankers, Vietnam mechanized infantry, Gulf War armor crews, Iraq and Afghanistan troops, recognized common experiences across their different wars. When given opportunity to discuss their service together, they found resonance in shared frustration about fighting with inadequate equipment, about watching friends die unnecessarily, about institutional promises that next time will be different, that never quite materialized. These conversations, occurring informally at veterans events or in oral history interviews, revealed soldiers' awareness that they were part of recurring pattern rather than unique circumstance. This awareness created both solidarity, understanding that their experiences were shared across generations, and bitterness that institutions seemed incapable of or unwilling to break the pattern that made each generation pay again for lessons their predecessors had already learned. The field south of Singling in December 2023 looked exactly as it had in December 1944. Flat agricultural land, frozen ground, bare trees marking field boundaries. A visitor standing where Company A's Shermans had advanced 79 years earlier would see nothing to indicate the violence that had occurred there. The earth had long since absorbed the blood, spring rains had washed away the scorch marks, and normal agricultural cycles had buried the metal fragments that occasionally still surfaced when plows ran deep. But for those who knew the history, who studied the maps and after-action reports, this empty field remained haunted by ghosts. The 37 men who died here, the dozens more wounded, the hundreds affected across subsequent decades. The physical traces had vanished, but the human consequences rippled forward through time in ways that empty fields could not reveal. The last surviving member of Company A, 37th Tank Battalion, who fought at Singling, died in 2019 at age 96. His obituary in a regional newspaper mentioned service with the 4th Armored Division and receipt of Bronze Star and Purple Heart, but did not mention Singling specifically. His family, arranging his funeral, discovered among his papers a map marked with positions and notes. Walsh killed here. My tank hit here. Morrison died here. Annotations in faded ink documenting a battle they had never heard him discuss. The map, donated to a military museum, joined thousands of similar artifacts, personal effects from forgotten battles, preserved by institutions but viewed by few. With his death, Singling's living memory ended. No one remained who could describe from direct experience what December 7th, 1944, felt like, sounded like, smelled like. The battle had completed its transition from memory to history. The contemporary United States Army Armor School at Fort Moore, Georgia, includes Singling in its curriculum as case study in combined arms operations and the consequences of technological inferiority. Officer candidates study the battle's tactical sequence, analyzing Company A's initial approach, the German ambush, the casualties sustained, and the subsequent assault. The lessons extracted emphasize combined arms coordination, reconnaissance adequacy, and the importance of technological parity. But these lessons, taught in air-conditioned classrooms with PowerPoint presentations, cannot convey what Singling's veterans experienced: the visceral terror, the helplessness of being trapped in inadequate vehicles, the guilt of survival when friends died. The institutional knowledge preserved is analytical rather than experiential, sufficient for professional education but incomplete as historical understanding. Arlington National Cemetery contains graves of at least 11 Singling casualties, buried among hundreds of thousands of other American war dead. Their headstones follow the standard format: name, rank, unit, date of death, providing no indication of how or where they died. Visitors walking among the endless rows of white markers occasionally pause at one of these graves, perhaps noting the December 1944 date and the 4th Armored Division designation, perhaps wondering briefly about the individual buried there before moving on. The democratic uniformity of Arlington's headstones equalizes all deaths: the general and the private, the famous battle and the obscure one, reflecting the principle that all who died in service deserve equal honor. But this equality in death obscures the inequality in life that had sent some men to fight with adequate equipment and others, like Singling's casualties, with weapons insufficient to the task. The few veterans who made audio or video recordings discussing Singling left testimonies that conveyed more than official records ever could. In a 1995 video interview, former Private First Class Robert Hernandez, then 70 years old, attempted to describe watching Sherman tanks burn with crews trapped inside. His voice broke midway through the description, and he sat silent for nearly a minute before continuing. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I thought I could talk about this without—" He did not finish the sentence, just shook his head and looked away from the camera. The interviewer waited patiently, and eventually Hernandez continued with different topic. But that moment of silence, that incomplete sentence, conveyed the trauma's persistence across 5 decades more effectively than any articulate description could have. When Hernandez died in 2007, his family donated the interview recording to the Veterans History Project. Researchers could watch that moment of silence, but they could not fully understand what memories had silenced him. The digital age enabled new forms of memory work that earlier generations lacked. Descendants of singling casualties created memorial websites, posting photographs and service records of their grandfather or great-uncle who died there. Online forums connected families who shared the specific loss of singling, creating virtual communities of remembrance spanning continents and generations. Some descendants traveled to singling, photographing the landscape and posting images online, sometimes connecting with local residents who provided additional historical details. These efforts created distributed memory architecture that did not depend on centralized institutions or physical monuments. But this digital remembrance also faced impermanence. Websites disappeared when hosting fees went unpaid. Social media accounts died with their creators. Digital files corrupted or were lost when platforms changed. The long-term preservation of these digital memories remained uncertain. The question that haunted later analysis of singling was the same question that veterans had asked themselves for decades. Was it necessary? The immediate answer was no. Singling had no strategic value. The village was abandoned by German forces days later. The battle's outcome changed nothing at operational level. But the deeper answer was more complex. Singling was necessary within the framework of American operational doctrine that prioritized maintaining offensive pressure everywhere simultaneously. The 37 men died not because singling itself mattered, but because the doctrine of continuous pressure required attacking everywhere, even at unfavorable tactical odds. Whether this operational-level calculus justified tactical-level casualties depended on whether one accepted the premise that rapid strategic victory justified accepting unfavorable tactical exchanges. Veterans and historians remain divided on this question 7 decades later. The comparative memory of singling and other battles revealed uncomfortable truths about how societies choose what to remember. Normandy beaches, where approximately 2,400 Americans died on D-Day, receive millions of visitors annually and extensive commemoration. Singling, where 37 Americans died, has a small monument seen by dozens annually. This thousand-fold difference in commemorative attention reflects practical realities. Limited resources, need to focus commemoration on events with clear strategic significance, preference for battles with heroic narratives. But it also reflects values about which sacrifices societies choose to honor publicly versus which are relegated to private memory. The men who died at Singling were no less brave, suffered no less, and sacrificed no less than those who died at Normandy. But history assigned their deaths to footnotes rather than monuments. The institutional legacy of singling in contemporary American military practice was visible in subtle ways. Procurement emphasis on maintaining technological parity with potential adversaries reflected lessons learned, partly from engagements like singling, where inadequate equipment generated preventable casualties. Doctrinal emphasis on combined arms coordination and careful reconnaissance before committing forces to engagement incorporated tactical lessons from singling's hasty approach and one-sided casualties. The M1 Abrams tank's naming honored Creighton Abrams, who had commanded at Singling with inadequate equipment, ensuring that future tankers would fight with weapons his generation had lacked. These institutional adaptations represented Singling's true legacy, not public memory, but professional incorporation of lessons that might prevent similar casualties in future conflicts. The final assessment of Singling's meaning required balancing multiple perspectives that could not be fully reconciled. From strategic perspective, singling was irrelevant. A minor action that changed nothing was quickly forgotten and contributed minimally to Allied victory. From tactical perspective, singling was significant, a clear example of doctrinal and equipment failures that generated unnecessary casualties. From institutional perspective, singling was data, one engagement among thousands, contributing to statistical analysis that shaped post-war development. From veterans' perspective, singling was definitive, the battle that defined their war experience more than any other, regardless of its strategic insignificance. From families' perspective, singling was tragedy, the place where father or son or husband died, creating absence that shaped their lives across subsequent decades. None of these perspectives were wrong. All captured different dimensions of the same event. The ghosts of Singling, ultimately, were not supernatural entities but rather persistent questions that each generation must confront anew. Why do institutions repeat patterns that cost lives despite knowing better? How can societies balance commemoration of iconic battles with recognition of obscure ones? What moral responsibility do commanders have when ordering men to fight with inadequate equipment? How should casualty costs be weighed against operational objectives? What distinguishes necessary sacrifice from preventable tragedy? These questions, raised acutely by Singling but applicable to countless battles before and since, have no permanent answers because each generation faces them in different contexts requiring fresh assessment. The empty fields south of Singling, where men died in December 1944, continues its agricultural purpose. Winter wheat planted and harvested annually in cycles indifferent to history. Occasionally, a metal detector enthusiast finds corroded fragments, a piece of track, a shell facings, a shattered periscope, physical remnants of violence returning temporarily to surface before being discarded or donated to small museums. These fragments are all that remains physically of the battle, insufficient to reconstruct what happened there, barely sufficient to prove it happened at all. The human remains have been recovered or dissolved into earth, the vehicles were salvaged or buried, the buildings were repaired or replaced. The landscape has forgotten, as landscapes do. Only humans remember, and their memories are ending. But perhaps the most important legacy of Singling is not memory, but rather the questions it continues to ask. Every time a military force enters combat with equipment inadequate to the threat, Singling asks, "Did you learn nothing?" Every time strategic objectives are pursued without adequate regard for tactical costs, Singling asks, "What price is acceptable?" Every time institutional processes delay adaptation while casualties mount, Singling asks, "Who is responsible?" Every time a battle is forgotten while its casualties are mourned privately by families, Singling asks, "Which sacrifices deserve remembrance?" These questions have no final answers, but they demand perpetual asking. This is Singling's ultimate legacy, not memory that fades with the last veteran's death, but questions that persist as long as nations send soldiers to war. The ghosts of Singling are not the dead, who are beyond caring about commemoration or lessons learned. The ghosts are the living who carry forward knowledge of what happened there, the veterans who survived and then died, the families who grieved and then aged, the historians who researched and then documented, the officers who studied and then taught. Each generation of ghosts passes the knowledge to the next, incomplete transmission, degraded by time and death, but sufficient to preserve the essential truth, that courage cannot overcome inadequate equipment, that tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic failures, that individual sacrifice, however genuine, may be forgotten by history even as it remains unforgettable to those who experienced it. The field south of Singling, empty and quiet in winter 2023, holds no answers. The earth cannot speak. The crops growing there know nothing of the blood that once fed them. The wind carries no echoes of the screaming that filled that space 79 years ago. But for those who know the history, who have studied the maps and read the after-action reports and listened to the veterans' testimonies, the field remains full, crowded with 37 ghosts who died there, the hundreds of ghosts who survived but carried the trauma, the thousands of ghosts in subsequent generations who learned the lessons or failed to learn them or learned them and then forgot them. This is Singling's final truth. Some battles are forgotten by history, but never forgotten by those who fought them or were affected by them. The forgetting and the remembering exist simultaneously, the gap between them representing the distance between institutional priorities and human experience, between strategic significance and personal meaning, between what societies choose to commemorate and what individuals cannot forget. The 37 men who died at Singling deserve more than they received: better equipment, better planning, better recognition. They received instead a battle that history mostly forgot, a sacrifice that mattered desperately to their families and barely at all to the broader narrative of Allied victory. This injustice cannot be corrected 7 decades later. The dead cannot be honored more or remembered better than they already are by the few who remember them. But their story can be told, their sacrifice can be documented, and the questions their deaths raise can be preserved for future generations who will face similar challenges and must decide whether to learn from history or repeat it. The ghosts of Singling ask nothing. They are beyond asking, beyond caring, beyond the human needs that drive commemoration and justice. But the living who remember them must ask on their behalf. Did their sacrifice mean something? Could their deaths have been prevented? Will future generations learn from their example? Will anyone remember when the last person who knew their names has died? These questions echo across the empty fields south of Singling, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, but demanding to be asked nonetheless. This is what we owe the dead. Not monuments or ceremonies, though those have value, but rather the commitment to ask the questions their deaths raise and to struggle honestly with answers that will always be incomplete. The ghosts of Singling deserve at least this, that they not be forgotten entirely, that their sacrifice not be meaningless, that their story not vanish as thoroughly as the physical traces of their battle. This documentary, this telling of their story, is small payment on an unpayable debt, inadequate recognition for ultimate sacrifice, but perhaps better than the alternative of complete silence.